Chapter 391. Yi Shiwen had finished absorbing the flaming sun real water, and his gilded tyrant form had finally made the breakthrough to the 6th layer. His whole body was glittering and emitting golden rays of light. Red drops of water were gradually dripping from his golden body. Yi Shiwen had felt as if his body was about to be torn apart once he started to absorb the flaming sun real water. He could feel his body transforming on a cellular level. He could feel his cells being torn open, and then reconstructed. Yi Shiwen had suppressed the transformation of his body. After that, he had focused all the accumulated energy into reaching the 6th layer of gilded tyrant form. He had consumed only 1/10 of the flaming sun real water from the pond during this breakthrough. No wonder it was considered Fire Cloud Cave's most hidden and precious treasure. The big pond was full of flaming sun real water, but everyone wasn't allowed to use it. In fact, only 1 or 2 experts from a generation were allowed to use it to attain the real body of the barbarian god. Only a few people had the authority to use this magical liquid. But the entire flaming sun real water had fallen into Yi Ziwen's hands. It could be said that this was his biggest harvest on this mission. Now, he wouldn't have to face difficulties in having future breakthroughs, thanks to this flaming sun real water. Ha ha ha, Yi Shiwen, you've developed quite a lot. And the flaming sun real water has fallen into your hands. So, you won't have to face difficulties in perfecting the gilded tyrant form. Yemo laughed out loud. He couldn't have obtained this opportunity if it hadn't been for the sudden outbreak of this battle, and chaos that had ensued thereafter. In fact, he wouldn't have even thought about this impossible task. Who are you? A man's loud shout was heard. It came from outside the temple. He wasn't clad in the common barbarian attire. He was dressed up as a mediator of the southern region. He was clad in white clothes. He had thick eyebrows and big eyes. He looked different from other barbarians. Yi Shiwen immediately recognized that person. He turned out to be his target, Zhu Tianzong. Yi Shiwen stepped out from the flaming sun real pond. He laughed mischievously. Then, he looked at Zhu Tianzong and said, I am Yi Shiwen. Nice to meet you, Brother Zhu. Yi Shiwen collected the remaining flaming sun real water from the pond as he said that. Zhu Tianzong's complexion suddenly changed. He said, You're Yi Shiwen? Zhu Tianzong had obviously heard Yi Ziwen's name. After all, Yi Shiwen was very famous among this session's disciples. Zhu Tianzong had never seen him before, but he could tell that this guy was indeed Yi Shiwen. It's impossible. I know everything about the people the true Martial University has sent after me. And I know for sure that you're not one of them. Zhu Tianzong's complexion looked ugly as he said that. Yi Shiwen realized that the Merit Elder had indeed been right. Zhu Tianzong had genuinely established a big information network during the many years he had spent in the Merit Palace Hall. Those people were sent only to attract Big Brother Zhu's attention. Yi Shiwen spoke with a light smile on his face. It is I who will take your head. You want to kill me? You're very reckless. Zhu Tianzong sneered and said, I know that you're a Heaven's Pride level expert. But you've brought about your own destruction by coming here. Haha, today I get to personally strangle a Heaven's Pride level expert. Zhu Tianzong burst into laughter. Then, his eyes turned fierce and revealed a somewhat cruel look. Zhu Tianzong sneered. His hands emitted majestic golden lights. This was his secret technique, Golden Cicada Sage Beheader. He appeared like the incarnation of a giant cicada god from ancient times. He streaked across the horizon as he flew forward. There were Tao principles wrapped around his body. He was an expert of the semi-sage realm. Yi Ziwen's complexion remained unchanged. He knew that the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave must have helped Zhu Tianzong with his practice. That was why his cultivation had increased so sharply within such a short time. The golden divinities began to surge within Yi Ziwen's body. His hair was blown upwards. Yi Shiwen launched his counterattack. He didn't need to keep the disguise of a Fire Cloud Cave disciple in front of Zhu Tianzong. Suddenly, a dragon's roar reverberated. His palm shadow covered the entire sky like dense rain clouds, and went towards Zhu Tianzong to grab him. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's palm shadow ferociously collided with the golden cicada's phantom image. The phantom image of golden cicada was torn to pieces and scattered. Zhu Tianzong's real figure had been hidden behind it. It was revealed once again. Yi Zaiwen's figure suddenly rose up in the sky. He brandished his palm and displayed the move Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. Suddenly, a golden dragon rushed towards Zhu Tianzong and struck him on his chest. Yi Zaiwen's coiling dragon palm had been practiced to an extremely profound level. Its power had also increased countless times after Yi Shiwen had deduced all its 9 moves. That golden dragon faced upwards and let out a long and loud roar. Suddenly, this entire place seemed like the country of the dragons. Yi Shiwen had integrated everything he ever comprehended in this simple move. This one move could even rip apart the entire world. Zhu Tianzong was caught off guard. Yi Shiwen had already arrived in front of him. Zhu Tianzong had looked down on Yi Shiwen since he himself was a semi-sage expert. However, he had never thought that Yi Shiwen would turn out to be so terrifying. Yi Shiwen possessed the fighting strength of semi-sage realm. The might displayed by his move was on the level of semi-sage realm. Zhu Tianzong's golden cicada had been ripped apart in a flash. However, Zhu Tianzong wasn't an ordinary character either. He wouldn't have been sent undercover to the true martial university for so many years if he were an ordinary person. Great heaven, catching cover! Zhu Tianzong had learnt famous martial arts in the true martial university. His entire body was enveloped in a massive cover of iron. This cover shielded his body. There were no chinks in his cover. In fact, it seemed as if he had practiced this technique to the peak level. The same martial art could display different might in the hands of different people. And the great heaven-catching cover had unleashed superb might when wielded by Zhu Tianzong. Some experts were able to fight a dozen experts of their level at once, even with their own strength suppressed. This entirely depended on the degree of one's understanding of martial arts. It depended on whether one's understanding was profound or not. Perhaps an ordinary expert of Legendary's great complete realm wouldn't be able to budge Zhu Tianzong's great heaven-catching cover. However, he had bumped into Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's innate talent might not be considered as top-notch. Yet, he was second to none in the younger generation, especially when it came to one's degree of understanding of martial arts and Tao principles. Bang! The golden dragon opened its strong claws and grabbed Zhu Tianzong's iron cover. Suddenly, it seemed as if the world had lost its color. A loud sound of the collision of gold and iron resounded. The dragon's claws smashed the iron cover into pieces. After that, the golden dragon rushed towards Zhu Tianzong to grab him. Bang! The dragon's claws struck Zhu Tianzong. His body was sent flying upside down by the huge force. Bits of his flesh and blood splattered in all directions. Zhu Tianzong's body got knocked against a pillar inside the main hall, and finally came to a halt. Zhu Tianzong had been nearly struck to death by Yi Zaiwen's attack. There was a look of utter shock in his eyes. Yi Shiwen had become so terrifying that even a top individual who had especially been nurtured by the Cave Lord wasn't worthy of being his opponent. The divine power unleashed by his palm attack was enough to overwhelm the heaven. Zhu Tianzong's complexion turned pale. He had anticipated that he'd be able to run amok in the young generation once he had stepped into the semi-sage realm, and had attained the real body of the barbarian god. However, he had never imagined that he'd come across a freak like Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen, you must know that you won't be able to get out of the fire cloud cave if you kill me. Zhu Tianzong spoke coldly as he clenched his teeth. His vitality had begun to gradually restore itself. His face had turned bright red. He was clearly using some type of healing technique to speed up the healing process of his injuries. But this healing technique was far inferior to the Phoenix regeneration technique. Yi Zaiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique healed very quickly, at the very least. In fact, it was so fast that its speed couldn't be tracked by an average person. Yi Shiwen didn't seem to care about Zhu Tianzong's unusual threat. So, he walked towards him step by step. Die! Shu Tianzong roared loudly. His entire body transformed into a giant golden cicada and rushed towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. It was rumored that this huge golden cicada had once slaughtered a devil god in the ancient times. Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden streamer of light and rushed towards Shu Tianzong. A fight broke out between the two. Bang! Their attacks were extremely terrifying and quick. The golden cicada and the golden dragon collided ferociously, and began to strangle each other to death. Their collisions unleashed a burst of endless divine beams. These beams spread out and cracked the surrounding space into small pieces. The temple was made up of some unknown yet hard stone. But it couldn't withstand the impact of such horrifying attacks, and collapsed into pieces. The flaming sun real water was a precious treasure of the fire cloud cave. So, the sudden collapse of the flaming sun temple immediately attracted the attention of several powerhouses. Yi Shiwen, you can't delay any further. The experts of the fire cloud cave will rush over any time now. Yi Mo hastily reminded Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen nodded. He could feel several divine senses probe this place. He knew that several experts would arrive soon. So, he couldn't drag this fight any longer, otherwise he'd die for sure. Ha ha ha, Yi Shiwen, you'll die today! Shu Tianzong had understood what was going to happen. So, he had started to laugh out loud. His countenance also turned somewhat hideous. Yi Shiwen would be done for, as long as he could last until the arrival of the other experts. Yi Shiwen sneered. Shu Tianzong's plan was good. But did he have the ability to compel Yi Shiwen into dragging this fight? Yi Shiwen brandished his palm. This palm attack was invoked with the roar of a dragon. A golden dragon appeared, and tore the space into small pieces. Yi Shiwen didn't plan to delay any further. So, he had integrated the entirety of his martial power into this one palm attack. He had basically turned it into a peerless attack. Bang! Shu Tianzong's golden cicada was defeated once again. Then, the palm attack went forward and fiercely crashed into Shu Tianzong's body. Puff! Shu Tianzong spouted a mouthful of blood. His chest caved inwards. He had used his hands to resist this palm attack. However, his hands had been broken in the process. Air started to leak out of his punctured chest as he suffocated to death. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate. He immediately collected Shu Tianzong's corpse. Then, he turned into a streamer of light and disappeared beyond the horizon. To be continued. Chapter 392 Returns to the True Martial University. The blue sky appeared clean for thousands of miles. There were no clouds, no wind. A figure was approaching swiftly from far away. He was anxiously rushing over from a distance. But the speed of that figure made it was very difficult to see it with naked eyes. His lustrous body emitted golden light. He was over 20 years old. He was clad in ragged clothes. Blood dripped from his body. He was clearly in a very difficult situation. A pair of golden wings was crazily flapping behind his body. Boy, you can't get away. I will dismember your body into 1,000 pieces just to vent my anger. A loud rumbling sound came from behind. It sounded like a thunderclap. This person was over 10 feet tall. He was an incomparably sturdy and old barbarian. He held a bone club in his hand. He was pursuing closely, and getting closer and closer by taking large strides. A terrifying power was wrapped around his burly body. One could clearly see that he was a terrifying expert of the great sage realm. Yi Shiwen cursed his misfortune. He had escaped after he had killed Shu Tianzong. But he didn't expect to find a great sage expert chasing after him just when he had come halfway to the true martial university. He would have long been caught if he weren't Yi Shiwen. Moreover, the devil wings was the world's top-notch agility technique. Without it, Yi Shiwen would have been caught and slaughtered by now. However, even then, Yi Shiwen had occasionally sustained the old man's attacks. An average person would have died if they had sustained such injuries. But his phoenix regeneration technique was operating frantically to repair the wounds. Otherwise, he would have died a long time ago. The collapse of the Flaming Sun Temple had caught this old barbarian's attention. He had become furious, and had rushed towards Yishiwen after finding out that the flaming sun real water had been stolen. Yishiwen believed that a group of great sage experts of the Fire Cloud Cave would have come looking for him if they weren't being hindered by the allied forces of the 100 Barbarians Cave and the devil worship cult. The old man's agility technique wasn't as profound as that of Yiziwen's. However, his martial power and cultivation were far more profound than Yiziwen's. He was constantly speeding up as he closely pursued Yishiwen. Yishiwen cursed. He would get caught soon if the things were to continue like this. At this moment, he faintly saw the true martial university up ahead. However, he was completely exhausted. He felt tired even though he was being supported by his gilded tyrant form. His real elemental energy had been consumed way back. So, he had consumed an incredible amount of Spirit Dawn in order to maintain his current speed. The Spirit Dawn and the primary Spirit Dawn were frantically burning inside the heavenly source mirror to supplement some energy to his body. The automatic regeneration of real elemental energy would have been of no help. After all, the Devil Wings was an outstanding agility technique of the Devil Kings. Only he had been capable of using the Devil Wings to travel back and forth across the world. He could travel thousands of miles in the blink of an eye. That old barbarian became anxious when he saw the true martial university getting closer and closer. He brandished his bone club. The bone club rose against the wind and went straight towards Yishiwen. It got bigger and bigger in size. Now, it appeared like a dragon bone as it advanced towards Yishiwen to tear him apart. Yishiwen accelerated. The devil wings started to flap behind him, non-stop. The intense howls of departed souls sounded from that bone club just when it was about to pound upon Yishiwen. The howls were the sounds of the people who had been killed by this bone club. The space in its path got shattered. It gave birth to an extremely horrifying scene. A loud shout originated from the true martial university at that critical moment. "Who dares to be presumptuous in our true martial university?" The void was torn open, and a big hand swept down from inside the crack. And it grabbed that massive bone club. Bang! The terrifying collision swept out terrible energy storms. Layer upon layer of storm was swept out, like the waves of the sea. They shattered the space, and caused the chaos to leak out from the other side. Yishiwen suddenly felt a terrifying aftermath hitting his body. His bones got crushed. However, he didn't dare to stop. He flew swiftly, and broke into the territory of the true martial university. That old barbarian looked bitterly towards Yishiwen as he saw him enter the territory of the true martial university. He couldn't do anything. He wouldn't dare to enter the territory. He would die miserably if he dared to enter this territory in spite of the fact that he was an expert of Great Sage Realm. He bitterly turned around, and left. Yishiwen heaved a sigh of relief as he saw that old barbarian depart. He looked up and saw Exhilarating city up ahead. The person who had saved him turned out to be the old city lord of Exhilarating city. Yishiwen was grateful to the old city lord for saving his life. He was in a very critical situation prior to his entry into the true martial university's territory. He relaxed only after he had entered the city. "What have you done to make a great sage expert pursue you for 10,000s of miles from the Fire Cloud Cave?" The teasing voice of an old man came from the void. An old man clad in black clothes slowly walked towards Yishiwen. He had wrinkles on his face. He appeared to be taking short steps, but his speed was very fast. He arrived in front of Yishiwen within a moment. "Greetings, City Lord!" Yishiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and greeted. He grimaced in pain because of the wounds on his body. "You still need to heal." "I must say that you're very courageous." The old city lord looked at Yishiwen and said. He shook his head and continued to laugh. Yiziwen's injuries had been repaired over the course of their conversation. He was nearly back to normal. The old city lord's complexion suddenly turned solemn after Yishiwen told him about the devil worship cult and the 100 Barbarians Cave's joint attack against the Fire Cloud Cave. These colossus forces held incredible influence in the true martial world. The consequences would be inconceivable if the Fire Cloud Cave had genuinely been attacked by the allied forces of the devil worship cult and the 100 Barbarians' Cave. This would have been a trivial matter if the 100 Barbarians' Cave had attacked alone. However, they had persuaded the devil-worship cult for help. The 100 Barbarians' Cave must have offered great benefits to them in return. However, thanks to that, the devil-worship cult would seize this opportunity to expand its influence. This wasn't good. In fact, it was very bad. The old city lord didn't stay for long. He hurriedly left after he listened to Yi Zaiwen's words. Yi Shiwen didn't mind. He advanced towards the Merit Palace Hall to submit the finished mission of Zhu Tianzong's assassination. He had thoroughly completed this mission. Countless disciples began to talk among themselves as soon as Yi Shiwen entered the Merit Palace Hall. Yi Shiwen has arrived. Oh my god, this is going to be a startling clash. Didn't you say that Yi Shiwen was afraid and wouldn't arrive? But he's already here. Perhaps the fight will break out shortly. Yi Zaiwen's arrival had set off an uproar. We can see a battle of life or death between two Heaven's Pride level experts. One doesn't get such an opportunity very often. I don't think that Yi Shiwen will agree to participate in this mortal combat. The opponent possesses Titan body. His body is incredibly strong. Yi Shiwen was somewhat baffled. What life or death battle? However, he wasn't interested in pondering over this matter. First, he wanted to submit the completed mission. Yi Shiwen went into the depths of Merit Palace Hall. The Merit Elder had already obtained the news of his arrival, and was waiting for him. He smiled as he saw Yi Shiwen carrying a person's head. He said, "We weren't wrong about you." He examined Zhu Tianzong's head, and was amazed to realize that Zhu Tianzong had already reached the semi-sage realm at the time of his death. However, Yi Shiwen had still managed to kill him. A whole new level of respect emerged inside his heart for Yi Shiwen. Anyway, our Merit Palace Hall owes you a big favor for this mission, the Merit Elder spoke. Elder is being modest. Yi Shiwen smiled and said, however, you seem to be in a lot of trouble now. You may not know this, but that Titan guy is looking for you. The Merit Elder looked at Yi Shiwen and said, our Merit Palace Hall can step in to settle this dispute if you don't wish to come forward. To be continued. Chapter 393. Our Merit Palace Hall can step in to settle this dispute if you don't want to come forward. The Merit Elder looked at Yi Shiwen and said. Yi Shiwen came to know from the Merit Elder that a storm had been set off in the True Martial University during his absence. Someone in the younger generation had stood up and claimed that they had broken through to the semi-sage realm. It had caused a sensation inside the university. That person was none other than the guy with the Titan body. He was regarded as a top-notch Heaven's Pride level expert in the younger generation. However, it didn't limit to this only. The Titan guy had issued a declaration of battle to Yi Shiwen right after he made the announcement that he had entered the semi-sage realm. Moreover, it wasn't an ordinary declaration of battle. It was for a mortal combat, an intense battle of life or death. This declaration of battle caused a huge sensation. Everyone was in uproar. Such battle only took place between two mortal enemies. This was going to be a mortal combat, and would only end with the death of any one of the two contenders. It was clear that the guy with the Titan body held deep hatred towards Yi Shiwen to have desired such a deadly confrontation. Thanks to Yi Zaiwen's previous battles, it was too obvious to everyone that he possessed a gilded body. In fact, he was also known as the Golden War God. Yi Shiwen and that Titan guy were well known for their incredibly strong bodies among this session's Heaven's Pride level experts. It was said that the experts with the Titan's body possessed the bloodline of the Titan race. That's why he had such an intrepid body. The Titan race used to be a famous godly race at one point of time. Yi Zaiwen's title of Golden War God was fierce. And it had spread far and wide. After all, he had repeatedly used his extremely strong body to kill his opponents. Many people were thinking who among these two individuals possessed a more intrepid body? It was already determined that the Titan guy possessed Titan's blood. But nobody knew anything about Yi Zaiwen's physique. They didn't know whose bloodline Yi Shiwen possessed. And they didn't know why it was so tough. It was needless to say that they were unaware that Yi Zaiwen's physique wasn't derived from his bloodline. Its toughness was derived from the practice of a technique called gilded tyrant form. Everyone was excited. They were looking forward to it. This was the first collision between two Heaven's Pride level experts of this session since they had been named. Undoubtedly, this was the most anticipated battle in the eyes of many people. And most importantly, the Titan guy had challenged Yi Shiwen to a mortal combat. They would have no choice but to go all out to kill each other in this battle of life or death. It was evident that one of these two experts would choose death over defeat. So, the fight was going to be intense, without a doubt. Countless people were looking forward to this fight, and many of them were discussing about it. After all, the martial arts competition among the four forces was right around the corner. The general conduct should have been to keep these geniuses out of the harm's way since they were bound to become main contenders in the upcoming competition. Let alone allowing them kill each other in a mortal combat. Most people believed that the Titan guy was extremely overbearing. Then, what was the need for such a battle? Was it in order to obtain the title of strongest body? Is it the beginning of the conquest to become the strongest in the younger generation? Does nobody in the higher authorities care about it? Shouldn't someone stop this fight? Many people were discussing about this matter. Some were excited to see the battle between two Heaven's Pride level experts. Some didn't wish to see the fighting strength of the true martial university decline by losing a Heaven's Pride level expert. This wasn't an ordinary fight. Victory and defeat wouldn't decide the result. A mortal combat ended very differently. No matter who would win or lose, the fight wouldn't stop until the losing contender had been killed. In other words, one individual, whether Yi Shiwen or the Titan guy, was going to die. The death of an ordinary person was nothing. But it would be a massive loss if one among these two experts would die, since it would be tantamount to the death of a possible future great sage expert. Some people had opposed this matter. But some people had also endorsed it. In fact, many people had even added fuel to the fire from the shadows. Some people even hoped for Yi Shiwen and the Titan guy to mutually eradicate each other. There were several people who were somewhat worried. After all, these two experts could become the true martial university's backbone in the future. So, they only wanted these two Heaven's Pride level experts to indulge in an ordinary match to decide a victor, and satisfy their curiosity with that much alone. They didn't wish to see a mortal battle. Many senior experts from previous sessions were also excited to see the match between this session's new disciples. Doesn't the higher authority care about this matter? Would they blankly watch the death of a future great sage expert? No way. I've heard that some high-level experts are supporting this fight. The chief of the Clear Sky Peak is going out of his way to support that Titan guy. Otherwise, how could this fight have been approved in the first place? Neither of those two experts can be taken lightly. That Titan expert has become stronger after he entered the true martial university. And thanks to his special Titan physique, he is capable of killing an ordinary expert of the semi-sage realm with just one slap. Yi Shiwen can't be taken lightly either. He has completed many impossible missions in the last 2 years. He even penetrated deep into the lair of the devil-worshipped cult to assassinate his target, and managed to come back alive. But that's useless now. Yi Shiwen hasn't stepped into the semi-sage realm as of yet. But that Titan guy has. And he's impatiently waiting to kill Yi Shiwen. It seems that he harbors a great hatred for Yi Shiwen. What kind of an enmity do these two have in reality? Every outsider had a different opinion. The Merit Elder lightly glanced at Yi Shiwen. The Merit Palace Hall wanted to settle this matter for Yi Shiwen because he had assassinated Zhu Tianzong, and they owed him a big favor for that. So, they wanted to seize this opportunity to return the favor. There's no need for that. I can settle this matter of my own. Yi Shiwen lightly replied. Since that Titan guy wanted a fight, he would give him one. He also wanted to know whether his gilded tyrant form was stronger than the Titan body or not. The Merit Elder looked at Yi Shiwen, but didn't speak further. He had anticipated that Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength had only reached the Legendary's Great Complete Realm, or quite possibly the initial stage of the Semi-Sage Realm. But Yi Shiwen was far inferior to that Titan expert since the latter had likely reached the peak of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. There was a difference of heaven and earth between the two. However, the Merit Elder felt that he had underestimated Yi Shiwen after he realized that Yi Shiwen had killed Zhu Tianzong without even being a semi-sage expert himself. Yi Shiwen wasn't as simple as he had anticipated. He could faintly sense that Yi Ziwen's aura carried the principles of the semi-sage realm. This had left him in even more shocked. The Merit Palace Hall had initially anticipated that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to settle this matter on his own. So, they wanted to help him in getting rid of this problem. On one hand, they wanted to help him because they owed him a big favor. On the other hand, they wanted to establish a good relation with him since he might become a great sage expert in the future. He became somewhat depressed after he heard that Yi Shiwen could settle this dispute on his own. However, Yi Ziwen's statement had made it seem that it would be a direct collision between two outstanding Heaven's Pride level experts of the younger generation, and a battle to death. The atmosphere was already quite heated, but it had suddenly erupted with Yi Ziwen's return. Many people had thought that Yi Shiwen might be scared, and that's why he had gone into hiding. However, these rumors vanished along with his return. Yi Shiwen wasn't gone because he was afraid. Rather, he was completing a secret mission. Nobody knew about this mission earlier. However, the Merit Palace Hall confirmed it later when they stood out for Yi Shiwen. However, the focus was no longer on whether Yi Shiwen was afraid or not. The first god and the second god had already arrived inside the true Martial University. Why didn't this matter make any noise up till now? It seemed like there were no commotions earlier because he was waiting until he had stepped into semi-sage realm. He revealed his identity only after he became a semi-sage expert because he could kill Yi Shiwen now. I didn't expect that you'd still be haunting me like a ghost. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted and spoke. To be continued. Chapter 394. Yi Shiwen, don't you dare act arrogantly before me. You'll be killed by the god this time. No one can save you. The young man looked coldly at Yi Shiwen and said. He was looking down on Yi Shiwen. He would have killed Yi Shiwen right now if the second god hadn't decided to carry out the task personally. The experts under the sage level were like ants. This sentence might seem like a joke, but there was some truth in this ages-old saying. Of course, this young man wasn't yet at the sage realm. However, he was at the semi-sage realm. This meant that he had touched the threshold of the sage realm. As far as he was concerned, there was no difference between ants and a legendary realm expert like Yi Shiwen. And this ant had dared to talk back to him. His complexion had suddenly turned ugly because of this. Someone like you isn't qualified enough to talk to me like this, Yi Shiwen replied indifferently. His complexion turned cold. He wasn't taking this semi-sage expert seriously. Humph! I would have taken your head myself and sent you on your way to the afterlife if the god didn't wish to kill you with his own hands. The young man looked coldly at Yi Shiwen. Don't think that the higher-ups can save your life. They've already agreed to the fight between you and the god. You can't avoid this fight now. Nor can you escape. Hatred flashed in the eyes of that young man. The army of God was well regarded on the ancient road. They were like the kings of the world. However, it had declined because 3 of the gods had been slain by Yi Shiwen. Several members of the army of God had left afterwards. This had led to their collapse. The god had tempered his body, and had obtained the title of Titan Body. However, that couldn't eliminate the fact that Yi Shiwen had killed 3 gods, and brought about their gradual decline. He felt that Yi Shiwen had earlier disappeared because he wanted to escape from the god's wrath. You members of the army of God really wish to throw away your lives? Yi Shiwen sneered. You're all just a bunch of idiots. Do you wish to die right now? The young man looked coldly at Yi Shiwen. He didn't restrain his killing intention as he continued to stare at Yi Shiwen. He was dying to kill Yi Shiwen on the spot. Do you think you're a god or something? That you can decide who will die and who will not? Unfortunately, this world isn't under your control. Yi Shiwen sneered and spoke. Do you think that you can kill me for him? That's really funny. Yi Shiwen grinned and added, "He wouldn't have waited till now if he was confident that he could kill me. The god is invincible. He has an outstanding personality. Killing you will be a piece of cake for him. He wouldn't have tolerated your arrogance for this long if not for the closed-door training that he had to undergo in order to fulfill our peak's requirements." That young man simply disregarded Yi Ziwen's provocative words. Idiot! Yi Shiwen didn't harbor a favorable opinion of people who blindly worshipped someone. People like this young man couldn't see the truth clearly because of such blind worship. Yi Shiwen stood up. He didn't wish to argue with this man any further. He flew towards the sky. "Where do you think you're going?" the young man shouted. "Chaotic heavenly territory," Yi Shiwen replied lightly. "God has challenged you to a fight here. Didn't you hear that? Are you deaf or what?" the young man asked loudly. "Your God is too full of himself." Yi Shiwen sneered and spoke. "Doesn't he realize that the world doesn't revolve around him? He wants to fight with me? Tell him to come to the chaotic heavenly territory. I would gladly make his wish come true if he wants to die so badly. I can see that you're afraid. You've been running since the time the god challenged you. You've just arrived, and now you're trying to escape again. You're a coward. And an incompetent person," that young man retorted sarcastically. Yi Shiwen ignored his barking, and flew straight towards the sky. "I will kill you if you bother me again," Yi Shiwen declared with a cold expression on his face. Yi Shiwen didn't mind fighting with that Titan body expert. But he didn't feel like waiting for it to happen. So, he suddenly didn't seem interested in the fight. Anyway, that Titan body expert wouldn't let him go that easily. But why was he willing to wait for so long to kill Yi Shiwen? "Stop right there!" That young man couldn't help but launch an attack as he saw Yi Shiwen running away. His entire body got covered in bursts of fiery red light. They looked like a group of flames as they went straight towards Yi Shiwen. The huge sound of explosion attracted the attention of many surrounding disciples. Yi Ziwen's return had already attracted the attention of many people since they wanted to see how Yi Shiwen would face that Titan guy's challenge. However, he was now engaged in a conflict with that young man. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything. The Han seal smashed down from above. It seemed as if a large mountain had transformed into a giant dragon as it swept down. It also carried traces of the earth attribute principles. They were seething incessantly, and looked exceedingly gorgeous. Bang! A loud explosion resounded as the two parties ferociously collided into each other. That young man's red flames got crushed by Yi Ziwen's Han seal. His red flames weren't a match for the Han seal, and had been crushed into light particles. The young man frantically retreated upon seeing his attack being defeated in this manner. And he tried his utmost to get out of Yi Ziwen's Han seal attack's range. However, Yi Shiwen launched another attack, and stretched out his big golden hand to grab him. The big hand appeared just like a golden cloud. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth, and ultimately pounded upon that young man. The young man wanted to escape. However, Yi Ziwen's big golden hand didn't allow him to. It swept down like an inescapable net. It formed a golden cage as it landed on the earth. It suppressed him with immediate effect. "No!" that young man screamed. "Fire Lotus Brilliant Sun Beheader!" The young man stretched out his hand and shouted. A flaming lotus emitted incredibly terrifying rays of light towards Yi Ziwen's big golden hand. It seemed as if they could burn the entire world. However, that turned out to be useless. Yi Shiwen casually stretched out his big golden hand, and it crushed that flaming lotus. That flaming lotus which could burn the world didn't turn out to be a match for Yi Ziwen's attack. Yi Ziwen's big golden hand rolled down, as if to suppress a rebellion. That flaming lotus had been crushed in a flash. Yi Shiwen slapped that young man. He went flying into the sky like a shooting star, and crashed into a mountain. The bones in his body got shattered as a result of the impact, and blood splattered. That young man of semi-sage realm had been defeated quite quickly. In fact, he didn't have the power to fight back. His offensive had been crushed by Yi Shiwen in an instant. Yi Shiwen hadn't even made any major movements. He had merely raised his hand to suppress him. This scene had stunned the onlookers. They had been attracted by the battle between Yi Shiwen and that young man. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would effortlessly suppress that young man by merely raising his hand. How is this possible? That young man is a semi-sage expert. But he couldn't even take Yi Zaiwen's one move, and was sent flying. Just how terrifying is this Yi Shiwen? Many people were left in shock as they saw this scene. They simply couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Now I understand why that Titan guy waited for his cultivation to reach the semi-sage realm before he provoked Yi Shiwen. He might become Yi Zaiwen's food if he hadn't cultivated till the semi-sage realm. This battle shouldn't have been so one-sided even if Yi Shiwen were at semi-sage realm. That young man is a semi-sage expert. But he still failed to be Yi Zaiwen's opponent. These Heaven's Pride level experts are extremely frightening. Yi Zaiwen's naming as a Heaven's Pride level expert didn't happen by fluke. Each of these Heaven's Pride level experts has their own trump cards. I had earlier anticipated that Yi Shiwen would get screwed. However, it seems that I was wrong. Yi Shiwen turned out to be so powerful that he casually defeated a semi-sage expert. I'm afraid this Yi Shiwen may turn out to be a headache for that Titan body expert. It seems like the battle between them won't turn out to be boring after all. It will evolve into a fierce struggle between two evenly matched opponents. Yi Shiwen calmly arrived in front of that young man, who had been nailed into the mountain peak. Then, he said, 3 days. I'll wait for him for 3 days. I'll leave after that. I'll wipe out your entire army of God if any one of you comes to bother me thereafter. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of fighting with that Titan guy. However, he was very annoyed with these flunkies of the army of God. The news about this battle spread out within no time. Many disciples who had been eagerly waiting to watch the fight between Yi Shiwen and the Titan guy were left shell-shocked. Most people hadn't been optimistic about Yi Zaiwen's chances. They figured that he'd die this time because Yi Shiwen hadn't stepped into the semi-sage realm, unlike his opponent. There was a difference of heaven and earth between a semi-sage expert and a non-semi-sage expert. In fact, most people had figured that Yi Shiwen might not be able to fight back when faced with a powerful expert of the semi-sage realm. Everyone was waiting for the members of Hidden Star Peak to step in to stop this fight. This was supposed to be Mortal Kombat. However, both the experts were like precious treasures for their respective inheritances. There wouldn't have been any problem if this match was only about learning by exchanging pointers. But they were expected to come forward to stop the battle if their disciples' lives were in danger. Moreover, there was a difference of one whole step between Yi Shiwen and the Titan guy's respective levels. Therefore, Yi Shiwen wouldn't lose face even if he were to back down or lose. After all, he wouldn't be losing to an expert of the same realm. Moreover, a short-term failure was simply nothing. After all, they would grow stronger in the future, possibly 10,000 times or even more. This wasn't the time for these young experts to stir up troubles, or put their lives on the line. So, a short-term failure had no consequence in anyone's opinion. Moreover, there would be many competitions on this road to invincibility. That would help them in understanding oneself clearly. It shouldn't be the strength, but the heart, that should be invincible. Only those experts who possessed invincible hearts would be able to walk on this road till the very end. No one could dare say that they were above everyone else. After all, there would always be someone stronger. But possessing an invincible heart would give one the power to surpass others. Yi Shiwen might not be a match for that Titan guy right now. Even so, nobody would belittle him for that. After all, Yi Shiwen was an outstanding talent, irrespective of the level of his current strength. Most people didn't say it out loud. But everyone had sharp eyes, and they had noticed this much for sure. To be continued. Chapter 395. Yi Zaiwen's strength had been ranked among the strengths of the Heaven's Pride level experts. However, Semi-Sage Realm was just the starting point for these Heaven's Pride level experts, nothing more. Afterwards, there was Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm. Therefore, this was just the beginning. It was difficult to determine the true victor in a battle among Heaven's Pride level experts, unless it was a battle of life or death. However, Yi Shiwen had displayed terrifying strength just now. He had suppressed a semi-sage expert by merely raising his hand. This terrifying strength had made everyone speechless. Yi Shiwen had once again stunned everyone. Perhaps, the upcoming battle would genuinely turn out to be a fierce battle between two evenly matched opponents. 3 days. Yi Shiwen had given just 3 days of time. He would leave if the Titan guy didn't show up within 3 days. This statement had once again left everyone in shock. That Titan guy had been trying to rally as much support of the people as he could in order to kill Yi Shiwen by claiming that Yi Shiwen was an evenly matched opponent. In contrast, Yi Shiwen hadn't even spared him a glance. He had merely said that he'd wait for 3 days, at most. Then he'd leave. And he would leave for the chaotic heavenly region. He was clearly looking down on the Titan body. This had left several people in uproar. People didn't find it strange that Yi Shiwen was planning to go to the chaotic heavenly region. After all, he wasn't the only Heaven's Pride level expert who wished to go to the chaotic heavenly region. In fact, it was said that the Titan guy also wanted to go to the chaotic heavenly world. However, he couldn't go because he had to stay here and wait for Yi Shiwen's arrival. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about his fight with the Titan guy. He was very busy. And if his opponent wasn't going to come out soon, then he might as well get the hell out of his way. Most people had initially thought that the Titan guy was very arrogant. They figured that he'd kill Yi Shiwen irrespective of whether he'd accept the challenge or not. He was extremely overbearing. However, Yi Shiwen turned out to be far more insolent. He didn't care about who was challenging him. If they wanted to confront him, then they must come sooner. Otherwise, they should get the hell away from him. Everyone waited for the Titan guy's reaction. Meanwhile, they slowly came to know about the conflict between him and Yi Shiwen. They found out that the Titan body guy was the second god of the army of God. It used to be a huge group, and had ruled the ancient road. However, it was brought to its knees when 3 of the gods were killed by Yi Shiwen. This led to the collapse of the army of God, and they hadn't been able to restore their prestige ever since. In addition, the first god had disappeared mysteriously. So, all the responsibilities had fallen onto the shoulders of the only remaining second god. It was difficult for the second god to support the army of God by himself. Hence, the reputation of this outstanding organization had declined within no time. They had gone low-key for a certain period of time. The grudge between Yi Shiwen and the second god was as high as the sky and as deep as the ocean. It was no wonder that the second god had started to look for Yi Shiwen after he had stepped into the semi-sage realm. Anyone would have gone crazy with anger by now if they were in his place. Yi Shiwen also came to know a lot from the rumors. He realized that the Titan guy was actually the second god. No wonder there had been no news about the army of God in these 2 years. Yi Shiwen had already killed the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th god. The first god had disappeared mysteriously. Such a massive army of God had become entirely dependent on the second god because of Yi Shiwen. Not just that, Yi Shiwen had nearly smashed and torn the army of God to pieces. This had scattered their forces. This had left the second god in deep trouble since he had to consolidate the forces. Therefore, he hadn't gotten a chance to come looking for Yi Shiwen back then. As a matter of fact, he had recently stepped into the semi-sage realm, and had finally managed to sort out the internal matters of the army of God. So, he could freely deal with Yi Shiwen now. Yi Shiwen was also determined to settle this matter of the second god. There was no trace of the first god out of the 5 gods of the army of God. And the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th god had already died in his hands. So, he would only have to be careful of the first god, who was still missing, after he had killed the second god. In fact, he could seize the opportunity to crush the entire army of God once he had killed the second god. After that, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have to be worried about anything even if the remaining first god were to appear later on. This was a rare opportunity. The opposite party was looking to seize this opportunity to kill him. Why shouldn't he do the same? Root out the source of trouble to avoid recurring future troubles. 3 days passed in an instant. countless lofty mountains of the true martial university pierced through the sky. The loud roars of beasts could be heard echoing from the mountain forests. It appeared like a wonderland in the human world. Hidden Star Peak was bustling with countless disciples. They had gathered to spectate. There were experts of Legendary Realm, Truth Realm, Semi-Sage Realm, and Sage Realm as well. In fact, several experts of the Great Sage Realm had been alerted about this. They had also arrived to watch. Yishuan waited on the Hidden Star Peak in silence. He was waiting for the second god to arrive. Suddenly, a loud shout rang through the vast sky. It pierced through the clouds in the sky. The space rippled like the water's surface. A light green figure ripped open the sky and rushed towards the Hidden Star Peak. He had a robust physique. He was 10 feet tall and looked extremely powerful. His facial features were as sharp as a knife. He had bright and piercing eyes. His eyebrows slanted to his temples. He looked extremely valiant. The space distorted and collapsed wherever that figure went. His incomparably dreadful form then swept out from the spatial cracks. The Titan guy has arrived! Some people with sharp eyes had recognized this figure. His overwhelming and strong aura had shaken the heaven and earth. It's indeed the Titan guy. Just look at his body. No wonder they call him Titan Body. He's got such a majestic stature. An ordinary person's physique wouldn't even come close. He possesses the bloodline of the Titan race. It was true. The Titans themselves were ancient gods. That's why his subordinates are known as the Army of God. Such terrifying, imposing aura can suppress a truth-level expert to death. He has an invincible body, one derived from an immemorial race. I'm not very optimistic about Yishuan. I still think that Yishuan has hope. I guess you haven't seen him fight before he unleashes an overwhelming golden ocean. He appears like a golden god when he casts out that golden ocean move. It almost appears as if he's God who has descended to rule the world. His body isn't inferior to that of the Titan body. I've yet to hear of an expert who could challenge Yi Zaiwen's physique. This will absolutely turn out to be a fierce battle between two evenly matched giants. Yishuan, come out to die! The voice of the second god exploded after he arrived in front of the Hidden Star Peak. The sonic booms exploded in all directions. It seemed like a Milky Way of huge sound waves had swept across. It had caused the massive trees in the surrounding area to collapse. Humph! You're an arrogant young man. Come, I'll teach you the profoundness of this world. A cold sound transmitted from the Hidden Star Peak. It was followed by a startling sword energy. The sword energy rushed towards the sky in a flash. It streaked across the vast sky and shattered the space. Even the chaos started to leak out from cracked space. This is a matter of the younger generation. We mustn't interfere. A discontented sound echoed from the depths of the void. A massive hand swept down from the sky and grabbed that startling sword energy. Bang! It seemed as if the entire world had collapsed and broken into small pieces. An incomparably horrifying light burst out in a flash. The yin and yang elements of chaos leaked out and spread around. The terrifying aura swept out in the surroundings. Wei Guangyuan, you old fart, you dared to go along with his unreasonable and reckless actions. An angry voice sounded from the Hidden Star Peak. Bai Jian Song came flying from that direction. His eyes were open wide. He seemed to be glaring angrily. Bai Jian Song had come out of his closed-door training because of Yi Zaiwen's matter. He had recently stepped into the Great Sage Realm. So, he didn't have too much control on his own power. His Great Sage aura was leaking out. And it was forming a terrifying cyclone around him. He didn't very different from a devil god. However, the place in the depths of the void was still tranquil. Nothing happened from that direction. What? Clear Sky Peaks Wei Guangyuan is personally supporting the Titan guy. No wonder he has dared to openly challenge Yishuan to a death fight, an expert uttered in surprise. Wei Guangyuan held a very high position in the Clear Sky Peak. He was the chief of the elders. He had personally shown up for this event. That clearly showed that the clear sky peak was supporting the second god in his mission to kill Yi Shiwen. Nobody would have bothered if this matter concerned ordinary disciples. After all, the true martial university had a massive pool of disciples. A large number of these disciples died every day. Sometimes they died in the hands of the experts of other forces, or got killed by demon beasts, and so on. Casualties to such disciples weren't unusual. However, Yi Shiwen and the Titan Guy were ranked among the Heaven's Pride level experts of this generation. Only a few people could be considered as treasures in a particular generation. They were extremely precious. Only these people could become the pillars of the true martial university in the future. The death of any such expert would set off a huge unrest. Moreover, both the experts were looking to kill each other. This matter was bound to attract the attentions of countless people. In fact, it could even lead to an overall conflict between their inheritances. Every heavens-level disciple was like a future pillar for any inheritance. Death of any such expert could injure their strength very greatly. The Hidden Star Peak had very few people. However, that didn't mean that one could crush them that easily. Clear Sky Peak was ranked among the top 10 inheritances. Their strength was profound, simply incredible. There was a possibility of a full-scale conflict between the two inheritances. There would have been no issues if this was a conflict between two individuals alone. However, Wei Guangyuan had arrived here. This revealed the intention of the Clear Sky Peak very clearly. They stood strong in the second god's support. They were clearly biased, and in favor of the second god. Bai Jiansong had immediately understood the Clear Sky Peak's intentions. That had made him furious. The Titan Guy himself was extremely overbearing. And now, the Clear Sky Peak also stood in his support. He couldn't help being furious at this. To be continued. Chapter 396. The confrontation between these two individuals had transformed into a confrontation between two forces. Moreover, these two forces belonged to the ranks of the top 100 inheritances. And the confrontation between these two inheritances would be a startling event. Bai Jiansong's eyes were ice cold. His recently attained fearful strength of the Great Sage realm was boiling. His real elemental energy was extremely terrifying. He could shoot down the stars and grab the moonlight by merely lifting his hand. Several people exclaimed in admiration. Bai Jiansong used to be at half-step Great Sage realm. But he had finally stepped into the Great Sage realm after 2 years of closed-door training. He was an outstanding talent of his generation. So, many people knew about him. However, he had been stuck at the half-step Great Sage realm for decades. But now, he had finally crossed this step, and had opened boundless future prospects for himself by becoming a high-level expert of the true martial university. Bai Jiansong had sword cultivation. He was a sword expert with tyrannical strength. In fact, he was far more tyrannical than the martial experts of his realm. Humph! Bai Jiansong sneered and brandished his sword. This caused an explosion. The startling sword energy streaked across the vast sky for dozens of miles. It rushed towards the second god to rip him apart. Bai Jiansong, you're too presumptuous! The expert who had been waiting at a distant place couldn't help but roar out at this time. Then, his figure finally appeared. The sword attack carried such a terrifying power that it couldn't be stopped from afar. So, this expert had to appear in person to stop it. A slightly thin figure appeared in the sky. His real elemental energy surged up in the void and began to boil. A big hand grabbed the sword energy and stopped it from hitting the second god. Bai Jiansong, you're repeatedly attacking a disciple of our Clear Sky Peak. Are you planning to start a war between the two peaks? Wei Guangyuan shouted. He had grabbed that sword energy. However, his white hair was still fluttering under the impact of the formidable energy. Bai Jiansong sneered and spoke. This disciple of your Clear Sky Peak is going too far. You're the one who agreed to this bull-shasterous mortal combat. You're such a moron. If this will lead to war, then it's better to start the war. Our Hidden Star Peak has very few people. But it's not easy to bully us. Bai Jiansong and Wei Guangyuan clashed as he finished speaking. They forced their way up into the blue sky while they remained engaged in a fight with each other. They tore open the void and went inside. Their battle was extremely terrifying. After all, two great sage experts were engaged in a hand-to-hand combat. It could destroy the nearby peaks. The sky was shattered and broken into small pieces. Endless amount of chaos rolled down from the debris. Several Sage Realm experts abandoned the second god's side and rushed into the void to keep up with Bai Jiansong and Wei Guangyuan. Even the Sage Realm experts rarely got to witness a fight between two great sage experts. Wei Guangyuan was a peak-level expert of the Great Sage Realm. He had been famous for over 1,000 years. Bai Jiansong was a matured person as well. He too had lived for hundreds of years. These two experts didn't belong to the same generation, but their power could easily overwhelm their opponent. They possessed outstanding power and prestige in their respective generations. Not to mention that the pure sword cultivation of these two was incredible and contained formidable attack power. It was indeed a wonderful duel that wasn't just exceptional, but rarely seen. The clash between two junior disciples of the same sect had given rise to this heaven-shaking battle. Humph! Yishuan, come out to die! Nobody will disturb us now. Let's fight! The second god sneered. His bronze-colored face exposed a somewhat evil grin. A sonic boom dissipated in all directions, and left the entire hidden star peak to tremble violently. Many experts in the surroundings were excited by this. Finally, this day had arrived. They had waited for 3 days. This was the first collision between two Heaven's Pride level experts of the younger generation. The expedition to rule this generation was going to begin from this point. The second god's cold fighting power spread in the void. His tall figure began to exude cyan-colored energy, which started to surge up. He appeared like the reincarnation of an ancient titan. The cyan-colored real elemental energy wrapped around his body like armor. He held a half-broken lance in his hand. It could be seen that this half-broken lance must have been patched up by an outstanding expert. However, it didn't look like the original one. He had inherited this ancient lance from his ancestors. It was said that this lance had been used as a weapon by a real titan once upon a time. The second god had inherited it from the ancestors of the army of God countless years ago. The lance he had inherited was broken. Later, he had asked the best godsmith to craft the rear part of the lance and patch it. It was still far short of its original power. However, it was still very difficult to endure. The space unceasingly collapsed and restored wherever that lance went. This continuous destruction and construction of the space left everyone to tremble with fear. The second god was without any protection besides that. His body itself was his best defense. Many people looked at the tyrannical figure of the second god from behind, and started to whisper amongst themselves. The second god was extremely tyrannical. It was evident from his aura that an ordinary expert of the semi-sage realm wouldn't be able to block his lance, and would be stabbed to death by the lance in one shot. In fact, no one knew how strong he really was. Nobody knew whether the other expert could resist this lance or not. After all, none of the other Heaven's Pride level experts had fought with him yet. So, people could also only speculate the extent of his strength. And now, they could obtain clues from this battle between him and Yishuan. He enjoyed an outstanding reputation. However, Yi Zaiwen's reputation was even more incredible. He had killed the disciples of the Law Enforcement Hall on his very first day after he had entered the true martial university. Millions of disciples had arrived in this session, but only Yishuan could dare to deal with such a matter. The second god's killing intention turned ice cold. The pain of losing his brothers had made him extremely ferocious. Even his killing intention had turned exceptionally strong. Nobody dared to approach him since his intense killing intention would tear them apart. In fact, his killing intention wouldn't just kill the body, it might even kill the soul. Several experts of the younger generation felt greatly disappointed with themselves since they had been secretly comparing themselves with the second god. They had thought that these Heaven's Pride level experts were just extraordinary, nothing more. And it was just their own bad luck that they couldn't become one. However, they had come to realize that they would have never been chosen as Heaven's Pride level expert even if they had a better luck. They had now witnessed the incomparable tyranny of the second god, and they had realized that it was impossible to reach that level. The Heaven's Pride level experts couldn't be taken lightly. Yishuan had also passed through many intense battles like any other Heaven's Pride level expert. And he had won them all in order to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride level expert. So, people had no choice but to acknowledge him. Bang! The golden divinities condensed into a pillar of energy and pierced through the void. It cut across the sky and surged up violently. It scattered in all directions like a golden ocean. It seemed as if a golden country had been formed, the very country of gods. A figure appeared in front of everyone. It was surfing on the golden waves. He had bright and piercing eyes, and the golden energy was surging around him. It was none other than Yishuan. The second god had moved at a surprisingly fast speed. But Yizaiwan's speed wasn't too slow in comparison. He rushed forward and arrived in front of the second god. Yishuan, I didn't think that you'd dare to appear before me. The second god's eyes turned bloodshot as soon as he saw Yishuan. He shouted as he continued to stare at Yishuan. Come to die! I must take the revenge for the third, fourth, and the fifth brother. The second god spoke in a low voice. It seemed as if the faces and voices of the deceased third, fourth, and fifth god had appeared before his eyes. It aroused even more hatred for Yishuan in his heart. You're the same as those idiots. You're as eager to throw away your life. Yishuan replied. His eyes looked straight at the second god. They seemed motionlessly glued to him. The second god became even more furious after he heard this. He couldn't tolerate to hear Yishuan talk bad about his dead brothers. This was a huge insult to their name. It was simply unforgivable. The silence suddenly perished as the second god moved into action. Two greenish-black lights were emitted from his ice-cold pupil and rushed straight into the sky. His vision was firmly locked on Yishuan. He certainly didn't wish to allow Yishuan to escape at any cost. Then he trod forward. The surrounding space bounced, and it was reduced to fragments. The second god swept out a cyan-colored sea of energy. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept towards Yishuan to engulf him. The world itself lost its color in the wake of such a terrifying attack. Most onlookers immediately retreated. They didn't dare to come close. They were afraid that the force of the aftermath would kill them. Yishuan refused to admit being the weaker one. So, he immediately rushed forward. An endless sea of golden divinities was unleashed in the forms of giant waves, and swept out towards the second god. Boom! The cyan sea of energy and the golden sea of divinities knocked against each other in the void. It appeared as if two gigantic oceans had collided in the sky. The surging waves of dreadful power were unleashed onto the surroundings after the collision. The two experts stepped upon those waves of energy, and arrived in front of each other. They could almost see each other's facial expressions. Die! The second god roared. The entire space collapsed around his body, and broke into small pieces. He discharged all his power, and it reached the pinnacle. He looked like the reincarnation of an ancient titan. His tyranny had reached the pinnacle. It was as if he was the ruler of this country, as if the entire world belonged to him. His lance swept down from the sky at a lightning speed like a long black snake. It shattered the space on the way as it arrived in front of Yishuan. However, Yizaiwan's extremely terrifying sword intention soared into the sky, and formed an incomparably huge sword intention. He gave a loud shout, and the golden divinities throughout his body began to surge. Then, the sword intention fell downwards. Bang! The lance and the sword intention ferociously collided in the void. A big section of the sky collapsed and turned into fine powder. The pitch-dark surface of the universe was revealed in the aftermath of this collision. The chaotic energy had started to boil on the other side. In fact, some of it leaked out and split open the nearby space. The first collision between them had turned out to be very stunning. The two of them retreated several steps. Both individuals seemed somewhat amazed by each other's power. Yi Shiwen and the second god were in good condition. Their bodies were their biggest defense. They had never come across any expert with a physique that could rival theirs. Yet, they didn't feel surprised, nor were sympathetic for each other. On the contrary, a fiercer killing intention as well as fighting intention scattered in all directions. To be continued. Chapter 397. There was no scope of sympathy here. Rather, it was inappropriate in this situation since these two opponents only had the desire to kill. Your gilded body is worthless. It'll kill you like a dog. The second god squinted as he spoke coldly. His eyes shone and emitted a sharp beam. This beam almost condensed into a solid beam of light. It could frighten a person's soul. It's ridiculous to compare your gilded body with my Titan body. The speed of the lance didn't decrease. It transformed into a black snake, and set off an incomparably powerful and terrifying aura. It pierced the void, and the sky got shattered into pieces as it rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Clang! Yi Ziwen's sword intention condensed into a long sword in his hand. Buried earth sword! The sharp sword beam sent out an incomparably frightening force. A long dragon was unleashed, and it moved forward to face the incoming attack. Bang! Horrifying waves of energy were swept out from both sides. The energy waves swept across crazily in the surroundings, and made cracks in the void. The two experts clashed in midair. They were trying their best to not affect the true martial university, as much as possible. Otherwise, the one to survive the battle would have to face the criticism of the high-level experts. Your Titan body is also worthless. The so-called Titan god race has nothing more than an undeserved reputation. Yi Shiwen replied coldly. You started to clamor about challenging me only after you broke through to the semi-sage realm. That clearly shows that your cowardice, and also your lack of confidence in your Titan body. Your Titan body is nothing but a joke. I would have crushed you like an ant if we were in same realm. Yi Shiwen had spoken this very calmly, as if this matter wasn't even related to him. The crowd heard this, and was sent in an uproar. He had dared to speak such insulting words in front of the Titan guy. No other Heaven's Pride level expert would have dared to speak such words. In fact, no one would have believed these words even if a Heaven's Pride level expert had dared to say such boasting words about being superior to the Titan body. However, some people had believed in Yi Ziwen's words. They didn't know whether any of the other Heaven's Pride level experts had reached the semi-sage realm, or not. But they knew that Yi Shiwen hadn't. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't even reached the half-step Legendary's great complete realm yet. To say that I could have crushed you like ant if we were in same realm, perhaps wasn't just boasting. Yi Shiwen was merely at half-step Legendary 9th stage. However, he could easily suppress an ordinary expert of the semi-sage realm. He would become far more dreadful once he had advanced to the semi-sage realm. Saying that he would kill him like an ant clearly showed his confidence and boldness. This was the reason why the other Heaven's Pride level experts hadn't dared to look down on Yi Shiwen even though he was at a lower level compared to them. In fact, some people even considered him as the strongest Heaven's Pride level expert. This was because he was still at a lower level. No one among his peers would be able to suppress him once his level would match theirs. Of course, one must also consider the fact that Yi Shiwen was making a constant progress. However, the others were also making progress, and it wouldn't be easy to surpass them. Ha 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 ha! The second god looked upwards and laughed out loud. The killing intention in his eyes had turned even more intense. He was always aware that Yi Shiwen was a threat. So, he had decided to wait and gain confidence by having a breakthrough to the semi-sage realm before he set out to kill Yi Shiwen. That was because he knew that Yi Ziwen's cultivation would be lower than his own by several levels once he had made the breakthrough to the semi-sage realm. So, it would be impossible for Yi Shiwen to catch up with him in such a short time. Perhaps, Yi Shiwen could jump several levels within the legendary realm, but he wouldn't stand a chance against him once he had stepped into the semi-sage realm. How could the sage word be taken lightly? Jumping level didn't mean much at a later phase because the key point was to condense principles. Otherwise, the fighting strength would remain stuck. However, he hadn't anticipated that he had made a massive miscalculation. He was sure that his plan was foolproof, and figured that he was absolutely safe. However, he found out that he had made a blunder after the fight started. Yi Shiwen was far more powerful than he had imagined. The killing intention frantically surged up inside his heart because Yi Shiwen always turned out to be contrary to his expectations. Therefore, he desperately wanted to strangle Yi Shiwen in the cradle this time. Several people exclaimed in amazement. The combat between these two individuals had indeed turned out to be a fierce struggle between two evenly matched giants. Neither of the two was ordinary. The second god emitted cyan-colored rays of light from his body. These rays of light began to boil. The sound of his loud shout proliferated far, far away in all directions, and shattered the heaven and earth. It was an exceptionally terrifying scene. The second god had taken the initiative and attacked. He advanced with large strides. It seemed as if his steps were shattering the void to pieces. He looked unusually brilliant as his cyan-colored figure dashed about. His massive imposing aura seemed like a huge mountain as it advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Yi Ziwen's countenance turned serious. He had said that he could kill that Titan guy like an ant if they were in the same realm. However, he mustn't spare any effort since they weren't in same realm at present. Moreover, he didn't have much of an advantage of having a superior physique like always since the Titan guy also had an invincible body, and an outstanding one at that. One, which had been famous since ancient times. He shouted loudly. The golden divinities surged up within his body. Then, the divinities swept out in the sky, and wrapped around Yi Ziwen's entire body. Yi Shiwen brandished his long sword with a clang. He issued a sword beam. And it seemed as if the universe itself would collapse at any moment. The energy swept across in all directions, as if to sweep away the entire world. The sword attack took the shape of a sword dragon, and rushed forward. Bang! The sound of the explosion resembled the collapse of a galaxy. The space got distorted, it then cracked open with a loud explosion. Then, the chaos leaked out from the crack. This was purely a collision of bodies, and not skills. This frightened the spectators even further. Their strong bodies were the biggest assets these two individuals had in their arsenal. They were colliding ferociously, and these clashes were setting off frightening shock waves of unimaginable proportions. These shock waves could crush anything that stood in their path. They were wreaking havoc by launching such vast attacks. They hadn't even used any exquisite martial arts yet. In fact, each of their attacks was 10 times more powerful as any martial art-based attack. In other words, they could merely use their physical abilities to crush 10 martial art attacks at once. A clash with these two would be disastrous for the experts of the same realm. That was because their attacks wouldn't work on those two. An ordinary attack couldn't even sway them. So, inflicting injuries to them would be simply out of the question. Yi Ziwen's body had left many people in shock. Yi Shiwen was well known as Golden War God. However, nobody knew what kind of physique he possessed in reality. It seemed that there was no information about such a physique even among the well-known tough physiques. The Titan body had an outstanding reputation since ancient times. However, for some reason, Yi Ziwen's body hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position while competing with the Titan body. This had stunned countless people. Yi Shiwen faintly felt that his arms had turned somewhat numb. This was the first time he had come across such a tough opponent. He remembered that the legends that had said that the Titan god enjoyed great reputation for possessing an incredibly strong body, and strength enough to lift a mountain without any problem. The second god was also amazed by Yi Shiwen. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be able to resist his strongest blow. This was collision of bodies, but the most important point to note was that Yi Shiwen also possessed extremely huge strength. The second god had the Titan body. His body was naturally going to be strong. But what kind of a body did Yi Shiwen have? Could it be that he possessed the bloodline of some ancient devil god? He quickly searched through the names of several ancient devil gods in his mind. However, he didn't find any similarity between any one of them and Yi Shiwen. However, he didn't have much time to think due to the criticality of this juncture. He sneered and said, "I don't know what kind of physique you possess. However, it was the biggest mistake of your life to provoke me." Yi Shiwen coldly looked at the second god. He smiled and replied, "I guess that you only find your own physique to be worthy of a mention. But your Titan body is crap in my eyes. Even if the Titan god were to stand before me, I would tear him apart with my hands." Yi Zaiwen's hair was flying in the air. His eyes were as sharp as knives. His fighting intention was boiling. He wasn't merely talking big. A practitioner could easily tear apart the gods and devils with their hands once the tyrant body technique had been practiced to the highest layer. Even the Titan god wouldn't be a big deal. Yi Shiwen was extremely confident that even the real gods and devils wouldn't stand a chance against his tyrant body, let alone someone human who possessed their blood. The people in the surroundings started to gawk at this. What was Yi Shiwen trying to say? Did he mean that the Titan body wasn't an extraordinary physique? Countless people felt their eyes popping out at this revelation. The physique of an ordinary person couldn't be compared with those special physiques as far as they were concerned. The special physiques might have some weaknesses, but they were certainly stronger when compared to the physiques of ordinary people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been regarded as special physiques in the first place. Moreover, the Titan body was the most famous of all the well-known special physiques. Those with special physique basically had invincible bodies. So, it was even more shocking if Yi Shiwen didn't possess some special physique, since that would mean that a person with an ordinary physique had been able to last this long in a fight against the second god. Nobody would believe this. Perhaps Yi Shiwen had practiced some kind of an extraordinary body tempering technique. This wasn't impossible. Not every ancient sage had possessed special physiques or some incredible bloodline. Rather, some outstanding geniuses had founded various kinds of body tempering techniques. And the practice of these techniques could enable one to challenge the gods and devils. This wasn't false. However, those power techniques had disappeared in the ancient times. And there were hardly any such invincible power techniques left now. "You're extremely arrogant and ignorant," the second god sneered. Yi Shiwen was fearless because of his ignorance, in his opinion. The Titan god had an illustrious prestige. In fact, he still enjoyed the name of a fierce god. However, Yi Shiwen had dared to say such demeaning things about him. That itself showed that he was fearless. "It'll send a heretic like you on your way to hell," the second god sneered and said. Bang! The second god trod forward. The sky itself fragmented due to the impact. He released an imposing aura, as if to prove that he held the superior monotheistic. Cyan-colored energy waves blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they swept towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen grasped his long sword and countered the incoming attack. Yi Shiwen displayed a remarkable sword skill. It seemed as if he was a sword cultivator. "My single sword move can unleash 10,000 principles." His real elemental energy no longer fluctuated on his body alone, it rushed ahead. The long sword in his hand was made of condensed sword intention. It darted out with a swoosh. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's longsword transformed into a sword dragon. It pierced through the cyan-colored energy waves in a flash. It then drilled its way into the waves, and rushed inside. To be continued. Chapter 398. Yi Shiwen wasn't unfamiliar with the sword cultivation power techniques. In fact, the buried sword secret was a supreme sword cultivation power technique. One's strength could level up to an incredible extent if it was comprehended to its fullest potential. The sword cultivation power techniques had always been known to possess superb attack power. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't used them. He had certainly experienced quick advancement as far as his sword cultivation was concerned. But it had been too quick. He had indeed witnessed a sharp rise in his sword cultivation, but it had been difficult to lay a solid foundation. Yi Shiwen must walk on the road of martial arts. and sword art was merely a part of martial arts. This was the reason why Yi Shiwen always followed the norm of preferring martial arts over sword arts. However, it was an undeniable fact that sword cultivation was superior in terms of attack power. Yi Shiwen unleashed the sword skills against his enemy. The long sword pierced through the cyan-colored energy waves, and arrived in front of the second god. Yi Shiwen had only brandished his long sword, nothing else. Bang! The most terrifying collision took place. It was a startling clash between Yi Ziwen's long sword and second god's lance. Endless divine beams were emitted in a flash. Their weapons had collided, and this collision had produced incredible rays of light. A frightening figure emerged from the lance. It was a very tall figure. It seemed as if it was the tallest figure in the world. It was the giant phantom of an ancient titan. It was extremely horrifying. He held a long and incredible lance in his hand. It was emitting incredible divine beams. These beams pierced the vast sky, and swept down towards Yi Shiwen to stab him. Yi Ziwen's eyes flashed brightly. That lance had a fragment of the ancient titan's soul inside it. It had been resurrected from the lance. Its incomparably dreadful aura firmly locked on Yi Shiwen. The murderous aura was swept out. It was as scary as its mentions in the legends. This lance had been the weapon of an ancient titan. It was certainly half broken. However, it contained the conscious soul fragment of an ancient titan. The second god had used his titan blood to stimulate the lance, and that had led to the ancient titan's resurrection. Clang! Yi Ziwen's long sword released an incredible sword intention, and it rushed straight into the sky. The sword intention condensed and took the shape of an old man in the void. It was the figure of that strong sword expert whom Yi Shiwen had earlier seen. He held a long sword, very tightly at that. His sleeves were fluttering about. He carried an aura so imposing that it seemed as if he was looking down on the world. His eyes seemed as sharp as a sword. The world has no choice but to follow my way. The Tao principles of the world swept out along with the incredible rays of light emitted by that sword expert. The sword expert suppressed all other Tao principles. Everyone had a scare. Apprehensive feelings had started to rise in their hearts. They felt as if they had no choice but to submit to this sword expert, and follow his invincible path. This was an invincible path. Everyone had to walk alone on this path. And to do so, they couldn't walk on their ordinary cultivation route. Not to mention that they would have to start their cultivation on this path from the beginning. That ancient titan figure had once suppressed the entire universe of gods with his power. However, no one knew that the sword expert was a great personality of the ancient era. He had never shown any signs of weakness. He would merely use his world-crushing sword to destroy his enemies' martial ways. The two extremely terrifying and ancient forces ferociously collided in the void. Their powers began to boil together. Both of them were utilizing the power of principles. The surrounding experts of the younger generation were covered in cold sweat. What kind of terrifying power was this? Both of these individuals were ranked as Heaven's Pride level experts. However, many people hadn't been convinced of that. After all, these experts themselves were geniuses from different regions. They couldn't have entered the true martial university otherwise. There were many inner disciples present among them as well. However, they didn't have any choice but to admit that those two were extremely formidable after they had witnessed their terrifying powers. Was it even possible for a semi-sage expert to discharge such power? This kind of an attack would be too exaggerated for a sage expert, even for a senior sage expert. In fact, this wasn't just pure strength. Perhaps, these two would be lacking when compared with sage expert on the basis on strength alone. However, an ordinary sage realm expert wouldn't come close to them when one would take the level of this battle into account. It could be said that these two individuals had grasped some incredible secret techniques. Both of them had come across unimaginable fortuitous encounters. The onlookers learned this as they witnessed the wills of these two men collide so fiercely in the void. Clang! 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 The lance and the long sword collided countless times in a split second. The Titan lance contained extraordinary strength. It vigorously smashed the vast sky into pieces. That old sword expert's long sword was incomparably sharp. And he cut open the vast sky with just his long sword, nothing else. The confrontation between these two had surpassed everyone's imagination. It was like the confrontation between two mythical characters. One of them was merely a leftover wisp of soul. It wasn't as scary as the real thing. And the other was a simulation based on Yi Zaiwen's experience. Yi Shiwen had started to question the origins of the mysterious space. That was because his mysterious space had managed to simulate the three elements essence, energy, and soul to mold the clone of the sword expert. And this clone was almost like the real one. The strength of the simulated clone was certainly far below that of the old sword expert. However, it was still very dreadful. Everyone looked stupefied. The powers of those two weren't that terrifying. However, the spectators could easily make out the exquisiteness of the martial arts being employed during the battle. They were looking at the battle between those two giant phantoms, and felt as if they were witnessing a battle between two Tao principles. The two phantoms certainly didn't have living consciousness. However, their pure and unadulterated fighting spirit had made everyone even more dumbstruck. It took long to describe the whole thing, but everything happened in a short period of time. And these giant phantoms had already exchanged more than 1,000 blows in this short time. Almost nobody was able to see the exact number of blows that were exchanged between them. Such power had surpassed everyone's imagination. But the loss of control over the phantoms was also apparent. Yi Shiwen felt that the old sword expert had nearly gone out of his control. It was as if the old sword expert had been awakened by the insane fighting intention of that titan. It seemed as if a trace of consciousness was still left in the sword intention. And it seemed as if it had been aroused due to the collision with this fierce opponent. Bang! The two giant figures ferociously collided, and then collapsed into pieces. Countless collisions had taken place by this time. That had left the two giant phantoms covered in various kinds of cracks. And this final collision had shattered them. Yi Shiwen and the second god rushed towards each other to kill. There was no trace of hesitation in their actions. The lance and the long sword streamed across the horizon, and went towards their targets. Puff! Puff! Blood splashed, and broken bone fragments were sent swirling in the air. Both of them staggered and dropped down since they had sustained terrible injuries. The lance had opened a huge hole in Yi Zaiwen's stomach. The cyan-colored energy was crazily devouring Yi Zaiwen's wound. Else, he would have recovered instantly. The second god had also sustained a serious wound. The wound had gone down to his bones. His bones could be seen from the wound's opening. He was cut from the shoulder, and down to his stomach. It was obvious that this sword attack could have cleft him in two. However, that hadn't happened, thanks to his tough titan body. His body was just like a titan's. Even so, this injury had turned his complexion pale. After all, he had nearly been split into two. Countless surrounding disciples were in shock. They felt their hearts tremble. They hadn't anticipated that these two would end up wounding each other in this first ever head-on collision. These two individuals with incredible bodies had finally entered the stage of melee-style fighting. They wouldn't be drenched in blood if this were only a practice match for exchanging pointers. However, these two were engaged in a vicious battle. Yi Zaiwen's long sword had almost cleft the second god into two. And the second god's lance had nearly stabbed Yi Zaiwen's heart. They weren't holding back, not one bit. These were precisely the so-called move of life or death. A couple of ordinary individuals wouldn't have survived if they were to exchange places with these two. One individual would have been stabbed to death. And the other individual would have been split into two halves. Both individuals would have died together. Even a minor difference of strength between two experts can decide the victor of the fight. However, these two apparently had same strength. They both stood at the peak of the initial stage of semi-sage realm. Moreover, the most important thing was that they had extremely tough bodies. Any other opponent would get killed in just one move when faced with either of these two. However, these two had merely sustained severe injuries when pit against each other. Not to mention that these injuries hadn't affected their vitality. If someone had dared to replace these two individuals, they would have died long ago. I didn't expect that the Titan guy would sustain injuries. This must be the first time he has suffered a loss. I've never heard of him getting injured before. He always relies on his invincible body to bully others. He has finally suffered a loss this time. That Yi Shiwen is abnormally strong. He doesn't seem to claim that he possesses some special physique. Don't tell me he has obtained the body tempering technique of some ancient sage? They had guessed it correctly. However, they didn't know that Yi Shiwen had only obtained the first layer of tyrant body technique. He had patched the rest by himself. He had created his own technique to suit his needs. He hadn't relied on the ancient sage alone. Yi Shiwen took the initiative and began to recover. He used his own energy to expel the cyan-color foreign energy that surrounded his wound. Then, he began to operate the Phoenix regeneration technique, and started to repair his wound. Afterwards, he looked coldly at the second god, and rushed towards him again. The long sword in his hand transformed into a long dragon, and swept down. The second god didn't get much time to think. He could only brandish his lance to defend himself. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword bombarded waves of incomparably terrifying force. They struck the second god, and sent him flying for a few meters. He was indeed sent flying for only a few meters. However, he had already fallen into a disadvantageous position. His Titan body did recover quite quickly. But it couldn't possibly match the regeneration speed of Yi Zaiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. Yi Shiwen was continuously maintaining himself at his peak condition. Meanwhile, the second god's condition was getting more and more serious with every passing moment. He had been slowly suppressed and pushed into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen. To be continued. Chapter 399. In a fight between experts, even a small disparity between the contenders could create a huge difference. Yi Zaiwen's strength was dependent on his healing ability, and it was far more formidable than that of the second god. This small disparity was enough for Yi Shiwen to slowly and gradually suppress the second god. Yi Shiwen consistently maintained himself at his peak condition. The second god also possessed an outstanding secret healing technique as well. Moreover, his Titan body itself was extremely strong. However, he couldn't possibly be placed on par with Yi Shiwen. I hadn't thought that the Titan guy would fall into the disadvantageous position. Yeah. It's very difficult to tell who's got the stronger body and who's got the weaker one. The disparity between their physiques isn't clear. But there is huge difference between their healing powers. Yi Zaiwen's healing technique simply goes against the heaven's will. It's indeed incredible. The Titan guy was very aggressive in the beginning. He was the one who came to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. He wanted to kill Yi Shiwen. But the outcome has finally turned out to be like this. Everyone discussed as the battle continued. The second god looked coldly at Yi Shiwen. Blood was dripping from his chest. Yi Zaiwen's sword had repeatedly struck his body. Even his Titan body couldn't endure such attacks. He heard everyone's comments about him, but he had disregarded them. He had indeed been suppressed. However, he was far from being in danger as suspected by the others. After all, both of them had sustained similar injuries. It was just that one individual recovered quicker than the other. However, these secret healing techniques had a common characteristic. It was to hurt one's vitality in order to restore one's injuries faster, especially when the wounds were serious. After all, these techniques went against the heaven's will. So, they had to come with a heavy price in exchange of accelerated recovery. Yi Shiwen, you're very strong. But you can only become a nameless skeleton in my path to invincibility. The second god's countenance turned ice cold. The wounds on his body unexpectedly began to transform into scars. Bang! The second god's imposing aura instantly changed, very significantly. A dark green cyclone began to revolve around his body. The metal rings worn on his arms and ankles began to rotate as his stature increased by a section. The second god had never revealed his secret true Titan body, the one that had been mentioned in the legends. This was the first time he had revealed it. He had previously seen Yi Shiwen as a formidable opponent. But Yi Shiwen had turned out to be even more formidable an opponent than he had imagined. His killing intention began to burn even stronger. His path to invincibility would become clearer if he could kill this super formidable opponent. Yi Shiwen, be careful. He's transforming into a titan, Yemo warned Yi Shiwen. His strength will increase by leaps and bounds after he transforms into a titan. Yi Shiwen nodded. He was standing in the sky with the long sword in his hand. He was blankly looking at the second god. He trampled the void as he fiercely trod forward, and arrived in front of the second god. Yi Zaiwen's sharp sword had cut open the vast sky. His killing intention had spread all around. The many spectating disciples of the true martial university were left in utter shock as they watched from afar. They could feel the astonishing killing intention that was coming out from his long sword. Then, they looked at the second god. His strength had increased by a layer after he had completed his transformation into the real Titan body. This left them dumbstruck. These two individuals were going against the heaven's will. The second god sneered. He grasped the cold black lance and rushed out. His imposing aura had become more powerful than before. This was indeed the real Titan body. All the heavenly races had been shaken by its power at one point in time. His left hand rose in the sky. It grasped a bunch of strong winds and lightning from inside the void. And then, he thrust them towards Yi Shiwen. The winds and lightning blotted out the sky as they rolled towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. These exceptionally terrifying winds and lightning could strangle a truth-level expert to death. An ordinary legendary expert would be seriously injured by their force. Gales and lightning were like pets for titans. It seemed as if the god of gales and lightning was watching over this fight from above as the second god continuously chanted some sutras. Bang! The gales and lightning swept down towards Yi Shiwen. The dreadful wind pressed down upon Yi Shiwen to crush him. This mixture of gales and lightning was like a grindstone that had advanced to grind Yi Shiwen to death. Yi Shiwen sneered. The thunder and lightning carried the strong positive power of the world. But he wasn't afraid of the power of lightning, nor did he feel restrained in the face of it. Could these thunders and lightning be more formidable than the energies unleashed by the heavenly tribulation? Yi Zaiwen's left hand transformed into a heavenly big hand. It stretched out, as if to grab something. Yi Shiwen grabbed those gales and lightning. Then, he began to operate the tyrant body technique and absorbed them in their entirety. This was the strongest ability of the tyrant body technique. It could absorb all energies, regardless of its type. It didn't follow the way of a benevolent king who would accept any and all. Rather, it was a tyrant who knew only domination. Yi Shiwen had just finished absorbing that energy. But, he saw a startling and black divine beam just then. And, it had already arrived in front of him. The space in front had collapsed, and had been broken into small pieces. He was still fearless. The long sword danced in his hand as he swept out a world-shaking aura. Yi Shiwen had used the buried heaven sword, and that too for the first time. Nobody among his peers had been able to compel him to use the buried heaven sword. The use of this attack against the experts of older generation would have been pointless since they possessed far more tyrannical strength than Yi Shiwen. The incomparably aggressive sword power swept down. It shattered the space, and the chaos leaked out. It seemed as if this sword would bury the heavens, restart the age of chaos, and open the pathway for a brand new world. The buried heaven sword displayed infinite power in Yi Zaiwen's hands. Yi Zaiwen's offensive had grown much more potent than before. His attack, and that long lance, collided ferociously. They came in contact, but soon moved away. Then, the lances and the sword's tip rushed towards their respective targets. However, the spot where the collision had taken place collapsed and broke down into pieces. A huge force swept across the surroundings, and even the void caved in. Everyone was dumbstruck by this spectacle. This fight had reached a mind-boggling level. Bang! A giant explosion took place. A figure went flying upside down. Blood dripped from his body and spilled in the sky. Everyone looked closely. It turned out to be Yi Shiwen. The second god's strength had increased significantly after he had revealed his real Titan body. The evenly matched fight had suddenly transformed, and Yi Shiwen had fallen into disadvantageous situation. The second god pursued after Yi Shiwen with strides as mighty as that of a tiger or a dragon. His lance swept down straight towards Yi Shiwen. It rampaged forward like a long dragon. It seemed as if it would destroy the entire world. Bang! Yi Shiwen firmly blocked the second god's attack. Yi Shiwen, you are done for. Obediently accept your death. The second god's countenance turned sinister as he spoke. The thought that he would kill Yi Shiwen had made him happy. Everyone's hearts began to beat ferociously. Could it be that Yi Shiwen would be killed? Yi Shiwen had fallen into disadvantageous position. He had merely relied on his excellent recovering ability to gain advantage over his opponent. But that advantage had disappeared after the emergence of the second god's real Titan body. The onlookers couldn't help but sigh with emotion. The special physiques had been famous in the entire world for countless years, and it wasn't without reason. They always possessed a concealed advantage that an ordinary person couldn't match. They could easily achieve the level of proficiency an ordinary person couldn't in their entire lifetime. Not to mention that the prestige of Titan bloodline had suppressed the entire world for countless years. However, Yi Shiwen clearly didn't have such an advantage. This was his biggest disadvantage in this fight. Therefore, he had fallen into disadvantageous position. Countless people were worried for Yi Shiwen. Yet, he was very calm for some reason. His expression didn't change one bit. The look in his eyes got more and more profound on the contrary. In fact, there wasn't a single trace of anxiety in his heart. These special physiques were outstanding. The second god had changed entirely after his Buddhist transformation. He had been beaten and suppressed by Yi Shiwen in the beginning. However, he had started to suppress Yi Shiwen now. This massive transformation couldn't be described in words. However, Yi Shiwen didn't lose heart. He had willingly chosen this path. He was on an expedition to fight and kill his way to the top. He had been in such thrilling fights several times. He had gotten so used to it that his heart was as honed as a solid rock. Most importantly, Yi Shiwen had understood that it must have been extremely difficult to exhibit the real Titan body. It was similar to any other secret technique, and would eventually get used up. After all, the second god merely possessed the Titan's blood. He wasn't a real Titan. Therefore, this transformation would end once his real Titan body got exhausted. However, this battle would still be a difficult one even if Yi Shiwen clearly understood this fact. The second god's moves had caused serious injuries to him after the transformation had taken place. After all, there was a big difference between their levels. Yi Shiwen would still have been able to suppress him by merely raising his hand if they were at the same level, same realm, despite the body transformation. An average person might not have been able to last this long if they were in Yi Shiwen's place and were to unceasingly sustain such serious injuries. In fact, they would have perished in 5 moves or less. The terrifying power of the Titan blood had been exposed in its entirety. However, Yi Shiwen had the Phoenix regeneration technique. It had maintained him at his peak condition. The only way to kill Yi Shiwen was to kill him with a sudden explosion, since it wouldn't give him a chance to regenerate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to kill Yi Shiwen. Time passed, second after second, minute after minute. Yi Shiwen sustained severe injuries again and again, but he managed to recover quickly each time. The second god had started to get anxious. Just as Yi Shiwen had speculated, it was impossible for him to maintain this real Titan body for long. After all, he wasn't a real Titan. Things would turn out very badly for him if he couldn't kill Yi Shiwen before he exhausted his advanced form. Roar! The second god roared. The lance swept out and penetrated the blue sky. The world suddenly lost its color, and the sky turned pitch black. Bang! Yi Shiwen's long sword welcomed the incoming attack, but couldn't block it. He was again sent flying upside down. He spouted blood, and the bones throughout his body got shattered. The second god was about to proceed to kill Yi Shiwen. But suddenly, the earth and the sky began to shake frantically. The sky disintegrated, and two suffocating dreadful auras swept down from above. A person's figure came flying down, and spouted a mouthful of blood. Everyone exclaimed because they had seen that person before. It turned out to be Bai Jian-song. He had sustained severe injuries all over his body. Another figure came chasing after. It was the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. Both of them had sustained serious injuries. However, his condition was much better than that of Bai Jian-song. However, he appeared to be in a distressed situation as well. His complexion was pale. He was at the peak level of the Great Sage realm. Yet he had been reduced to such a distressed state by Bai Jian-song, a man who had stepped into the initial stage of the Great Sage realm only recently. To be continued. Chapter 400. There must have been a difference of heaven and earth between the initial stage of the Great Sage realm and the Great Sage complete realm. However, he had still been put into such a distressed situation by Bai Jian-song. He had lost face because of this. So, he felt humiliated. His complexion had also turned exceptionally unsightly. However, he couldn't give much thought to this right now. He coldly looked at Bai Jian-song and said, "The higher authorities have agreed for this fight. It doesn't matter whether your Hidden Star Peak agrees or not." His voice thundered like the sound of a big bell. It shook many of the spectating experts. They staggered a little since they couldn't stand steadily. This was a terrifying senior expert of the Great Sage realm. Even a breath of his could blow them away and kill a group of people in one fell swoop. The eyes of the Clear Sky Peak senior elder turned ice-cold as he looked at Yi Shiwen. His gaze was exceptionally cold. He originally wouldn't have gone as far as to personally get involved in this mess. However, nobody could harmonize this conflict between the second god and Yi Shiwen. These two individuals weren't fighting to attain hegemony in the younger generation. Rather, they were mortal enemies. One of them would inevitably have to die. So, the Clear Sky Peak could only support its own disciple under these circumstances. The Clear Sky Peak had paid an incredible price in order to get the high-level experts' approval that had allowed them to show their support towards the second god. The second god possessed the blood of the Titan race. He would have incredible future prospects. In fact, he had even been assigned the position of the chief disciple. They had high hopes from the second god. It was a known fact that the true Martial University recruited disciples once in 100 years. Moreover, there was no lack of Heaven's Pride level experts among these new disciples. And the Clear Sky Peak was ranked among the top 10 inheritances. Many Heaven's Pride level experts would often choose to join one of these top inheritances. The Clear Sky Peak had only seen 3 Heaven's Pride level experts join their ranks in this millennium, and all of them had already entered the Sage realm at the time of their joining. However, they had finally selected the second god, and had assigned him the position of the chief. One could imagine his value in their eyes. However, the second god had this kind of a mortal enemy. So it was worth it to spend some more to help him get rid of this enemy. It was better than offending some old and stubborn high-level expert. Not many people would be offended anyway. However, every member of Hidden Star Peak wanted to settle this dispute for Yi Ziwen's sake. However, he wouldn't let anybody interfere in this battle. In fact, he himself wouldn't intervene. One mustn't disturb this fight between the disciples regardless of its outcome. Moreover, he didn't need to interfere because the second god had already obtained the victor's position. Bull*T. I don't care what your higher-ups have agreed to. Damn it all. You've dared to aim for a person of our Hidden Star Peaks, and it is only to break our backbone. You did that so our peak isn't able to make it through this hard time. Bai Jian-song roared. Blood spilled out from the corner of his mouth. The people of Hidden Star Peak had never bothered to hide their shortcomings from the others. The senior elder of the Clear Sky pair didn't care about Bai Jian-song's clamoring. He took it as a funny joke. The Hidden Star Peak was undoubtedly a latent power. However, Clear Sky Peak wasn't a simple power either. And it certainly wasn't like the War Dead Star Peak, whose chief had been chased around like a dog by Huang Wuji. Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances. And the War Dead Star Peak hadn't even entered among the top 100 inheritances. There was an unimaginable difference between the two forces. The Hidden Star Peak had maintained a low profile. So much so that many people were unaware of the Hidden Star Peak's true power. Everyone drew out their conclusion on the basis of the battle that had just taken place. How strong was Bai Jiansong? He had stepped into the Great Sage Real at such a young age. He would have boundless prospects in the future. However, he still wasn't an opponent for a senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. His cultivation was too short and lacking in comparison. Perhaps, this weakness wouldn't have been this obvious if he had fought against an opponent from the younger generation. However, it had gotten exposed in its entirety while facing a tyrannical expert of the older generation. Presumptuous! The Clear Sky Peak senior elder coldly scolded. Who are you to raise your voice against a high-level decision? Damn it! You old bastard! You will pay if something happens to my sixth brother! Bai Jiansong exclaimed. Meanwhile, it seemed as if Yishiwen and the second god hadn't even noticed these two terrifying experts. They just continued to fight. It should be mentioned that the second god had become relaxed after he saw that the elder of the Clear Sky Peak had gained an upper hand. In fact, he had become even more impatient to kill Yishiwen. And Yishiwen had started to resist the second god's attacks even more wholeheartedly. The two of them were too busy to worry about others. They continued to fight. The second god launched an attack. It seemed as if the world itself had lost its color, as if the sky would come crashing down to the ground. The vigorous power of the lance exploded, and rushed straight towards Yishiwen to kill him. The second god hadn't used any unnecessary skills. He had merely used pure energy in this attack. Yi Zaiwen's long sword danced in his hand. The sword intention overflowed in the surroundings. Yi Zaiwen's previous attacks had certainly been repelled. However, Yi Zaiwen's fighting intention hadn't declined one bit. His attack rushed into the sky. The point of the lance emitted a white beam in reply. The battle had turned exceptionally intense. Blood was unceasingly gushing out of Yi Zaiwen's body. But his wounds had instantly repaired once again. But some wounds had gradually started to appear on the second god's body. The wounds weren't very deep. However, it was still bad when one considers that he was in his transformed form. Many onlookers exclaimed. Several of them were very impressed to see that Yishiwen could actually injure the real Titan body. He had only done minor damage, but it was enough to prove their speculation that Yishiwen would go for a major counterattack once the second god's real Titan body subsided. Bang! Both of them ferociously collided once again. Then, they were sent flying in the sky by the collision, though Yishiwen went much farther. Both of them spouted blood. Both of them had arrived in an either-side wins situation once again. Their bodies were covered in all kinds of wounds, and blood continued to ooze out from these wounds. Yishiwen had sustained more severe injuries than the second god. However, Yi Zaiwen's wounds got restored in a flash once again. This Yishiwen is holding his own in this battle against the real body of a Titan. This is unbelievable. An average person's bones would have shattered into pieces if they had received one such blow. And the next blow would have crushed them to death. Perhaps, this situation is unfavorable for the Titan guy. As you can see, Yishiwen has slowly started to gain the power to fight back. Perhaps, this isn't very good news for that Titan guy. Yishiwen may make a sudden comeback as long as he doesn't kill Yishiwen in one blow. Yi Zaiwen's recovery may not continue like this for long in my opinion. However, it's also possible that the Titan guy won't be able to keep his real Titan form for long. This Titan guy has always done things his own way. He's arrogant and despotic. He doesn't pay attention to anyone. There are rumors that the Clear Sky Peak has paid a considerable price because the Titan guy stood up and took the oath that he'll forever and ever guard the Clear Sky Peak. That's how he has obtained the Clear Sky Peak's support. Well, anyone would agree to the fact that it's extremely tough to get rid of Yishiwen. Die! The second god roared. His entire body got covered with cyan-colored energy waves as he swept forward. The entire world trembled. It seemed as if an ancient Titan god had been resurrected. He went all out in an effort to kill Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen didn't hold back either. His body was his best defense. So, he continued to fight. This was a battle of life or death, an incredible mortal combat. Both the individuals had gone all out. So, even a small negligence could cost them their life. Both the individuals had put their lives on stake. Other people felt their hair stand on end. This mortal combat had left them in utter shock. Especially Yi Shiwen, since he had managed to keep up with the Titan guy till now. After all, his cultivation level was far inferior to the second god's. The second god growled. Yi Shiwen had been gradually returning to the earlier situation, where he had the upper hand. The second god knew that Yi Shiwen hadn't become stronger. Rather, he himself had become weaker. The suddenly outburst of power that was required for kickstarting and maintaining the transformation had left him weaker than before. Therefore, his transformation had started to fade. His eyes flashed as he stimulated his blood to unleash all sorts of Titan arts, and all of them were aimed at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen merely brandished his sword to tackle to the incoming attacks. No matter what kind of Titan powers you throw at me, my one sword move can destroy 10,000 principles. Yi Shiwen's long sword vigorously began to gather energy, and suddenly launched an enormous attack. Both of these individuals were walking on the same route, the so-called route to the Great Tao, and they must arrive there easily. The easier it will be, the closer one would get to the Great Tao, and the more terrifying one would become. These two had mutually chosen the easier path of attempting to kill one another. Therefore, only one would come out victorious. This path was easier, that's all. From the second god slowly occupying an absolute upper hand, to Yi Shiwen regaining his position in the battle, this battle had reached its most tragic phase. Both of these individuals had caused severe wounds on the body of the opposite party, and these wounds were difficult to heal. The blood was gushing out of those wounds. They had thoroughly beaten each other's bodies. Their bodies were completely covered in blood as a result. Rumble! They collided again, and a figure went flying upside down. Everyone looked closely. It was the second god. On watching carefully, one could see that the second god's real Titan body had disappeared. There was no difference between him and an average person at this moment. Blood was dripping from his body. He had fallen into the disadvantageous position in this clash of absolute power. Yi Shiwen's sword slashed several times. Each of his slashes cut through the Tao principles of the world. It seemed as if the era of primal chaos had been restarted. The sword slashes rushed towards the second god, one by one. It seemed as if they were pursuing his soul. This was Yi Shiwen's turn to counterattack. It seemed as if the heaven and the earth, the sun and the moon, had started to revolve around Yi Shiwen's long sword. Those who wouldn't obey would be cut apart. Yi Shiwen pushed the second god into the disadvantageous position. Everyone was dumbstruck by this. Many people had already guessed this move, but they were still extremely shocked to witness it happen in reality. Puchi! Yi Shiwen's long sword emitted an incredible divine beam. It chopped off second god's left arm. This fight had entered the deciding stage of life or death very quickly. The second god screamed. His entire body was covered with bloodstains. Even his courage had been cut off by Yi Shiwen. Some bitter resentment was left in his eyes, but he no longer had that same imposing aura he previously did. He still possessed the invincible strength, but no longer had the invincible heart. Everyone had gone silent. Nobody had thought that this could be the outcome. There would have been no problems if the second god had been merely killed. However, he had been first brought to the point of being terrified before getting killed. He would now be scared until he had died. After all, he had even used his biggest hidden trump card. Still, he had miserably failed to beat Yi Shiwen. How could he not be terrified after that? I'm invincible. You're merely relying on your secret technique and nothing more. Otherwise, I would have killed you effortlessly. the second god said, and it seemed like he hadn't yet resigned. Humph! In relying on secret technique? You have a Titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that Titan body. You're very stupid, Yi Shiwen coldly retorted. To be continued. Chapter 401. Yi Shiwen wasn't angered by the second god's remark. Rather, he found it laughable. The second god was too naive in making such a ridiculous claim that Yi Shiwen had relied on a secret technique. He himself had relied on his Titan body to spread his tyranny. However, he hadn't thought that he wouldn't have been ranked as a Heaven's Pride level expert if he didn't have the Titan body. He had consistently flown with the wind, and had ended up becoming accustomed to it. It was normal if he won. However, if someone else won, it meant that they had drawn support from some secret technique. According to him, his Titan body must be treated as an ordinary fighting power, while the other secret techniques were external powers. This was a very immature and laughable way of thinking. The second god had never come across any setbacks or defeat in the past. And Yi Shiwen had emerged from the bottom, and had made his way to the top by killing everyone who stood in his way. There was nothing to compare between these two individuals. Yi Shiwen had never thought about how outstanding his innate talent was, or how noble his bloodline was. He merely wanted to get stronger than the others, and he had struggled for the same purpose. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that every single step that he had taken had left bloody footprints behind. A short-time defeat couldn't sway his firm mindset. So what if the opponent was stronger than him? It didn't matter whether his opponent was using his own strength, or some external help. He would do anything in his power to kill his enemy. He would hone his own strength and get stronger if he didn't have enough strength. He would strive to surpass his opponent, no matter what. And then, he would defeat them. This was precisely because he had never placed himself above everyone else. He knew that there must be others who were probably stronger than him. He also didn't consider his innate talent to be at the peak. Therefore, a temporary setback was unlikely to sway his confidence. However, the second god was different. He had always had a smooth sailing. His Titan body had given him invincible confidence. Even the other Heaven's Pride level experts were afraid of the consequences. However, he had never thought of the possibility of losing. Today, his biggest moral support had been smashed by Yi Shiwen. One could only imagine the kind of mental state he was in. Humph! In relying on secret technique? You have a Titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that Titan body. You're very stupid, Yi Shiwen coldly retorted. Bang! Yi Shiwen slapped the second god, and he went flying in the sky. He spouted blood from his mouth. His robust body had gone flying upside down. Fortunately, the Titan body was incomparably strong. This slap would have smashed another person's body into pieces. However, even then, his flesh had cracked open. His red blood, which was mixed with cyan-colored divine blood, gushed out like a shower. Everyone was dumbstruck. A pin-drop silence spread. Everyone was in utter shock after they witnessed this. This scene was extremely horrifying. Those who saw this scene were extremely terrified. They had speculated how this mortal combat would turn out to be, and how one person would win the battle by a narrow margin. However, it turned out to be very different from what they had anticipated. There had always been a big gap between the two fighters. The Titan guy had initially suppressed Yi Shiwen with the help of his Titan body. And then, Yi Shiwen had fought back and suppressed him. Then again, he had unleashed the real Titan body, and had suppressed Yi Shiwen completely. Thereafter, Yi Shiwen made a comeback in the end. However, he had now come across Yi Shiwen's cruel suppression. The Titan guy had gained fame several years ago. He had enjoyed the reputation of a top-notch expert of the younger generation in his early days on this ancient road. In fact, he had attracted the attention of the experts of the true martial university before he had even stepped on this ancient road. He hadn't joined the true martial university willingly, as if to boast his own importance. Rather, he had stepped on this ancient road. Even so, he had managed to gain an outstanding reputation. He had caught the attention of several experts of the true martial university from that time itself. However, nobody knew where Yi Shiwen was at that time. Yi Shiwen used to be one of the outstanding new talents who had risen abruptly at that time. But he was far from being comparable to the second god. They didn't belong to the same level. However, nobody had thought that the second god would be suppressed by Yi Shiwen. They had never anticipated that a man who had already stepped into the semi-sage realm would be suppressed by one who hadn't even entered the semi-sage realm. This outcome would have been normal if they were at the same realm. After all, even a small disparity between the contending experts could create a huge difference in the fight's outcome. Therefore, determining the winner in a single move wasn't something strange either. However, it turned out that Yi Shiwen hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm, let alone the semi-sage realm. Even so, he had completely suppressed the second god. The second god had been beaten miserably. In fact, he was nearly half dead. One of his arms had been cut off, and he had been sent flying into the sky by a slap. Impossible! I'm invincible! You're nothing compared to me! The second god roared. His black hair swirled in the wind. His mind was in chaos. He believed that he was invincible. However, the facts showed otherwise. He had suffered defeat at the hands of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, it wasn't an ordinary defeat, but a crushing one. He had basically been suppressed by Yi Shiwen very thoroughly. So, how could he possibly be invincible after that? How did this happen? The second god appeared like a madman at this moment. He shot a punch across the sky. The endless thunder and lightning mixed with a cyan-colored storm, and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. He straightway abandoned the lance, and used the remarkable Titan powers. Titan race had once shaken the entire world and the heavenly clans with their inherent powers. The second god's move exploded the world, and it seemed as if the world had lost its color. An ancient aura swept out. It seemed as if this aura had crossed the river of time to arrive from the past. Yi Shiwen exposed a cold smile. His golden divinity started to surge and boil. He used the move Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. His hands transformed into a pair of dragon claws, and welcomed the incoming attack. Rumble! The second god was struck by Yi Shiwen again, and was sent flying into the sky. His arm was shattered by the terrifying power. This was the first time he had fallen behind in a clash of pure strength. His arm had been crushed by Yi Shiwen. This outcome would have been unimaginable during the early phase of their battle. However, it seemed pretty normal at this time. Nobody felt anything wrong with it. Everyone knew that Yi Shiwen had gained an upper hand. The second god had been trapped in confusion. It wasn't like he didn't have the power to fight on equal terms. However, he was no longer Yi Shiwen's opponent now. That was because Yi Shiwen had seized his willpower, and had eliminated his fighting intention. It's impossible! Blood was unceasingly gushing out from the corners of the second god's mouth. It was very hard to believe. What Titan body? Your ancestors were Titans, but do you know how formidable they were in reality? Those formidable and glorious Titans disappeared long ago. Moreover, you only possess Titan's blood, nothing more. Yet you proudly rely on your Titan power? In fact, you dare to boast about it? Don't you think it's rather laughable? Only an invincible heart can lead you on the road to invincibility. Anything else is insufficient to depend on. Yi Shiwen spoke. Do you think that I'm fortunate to have this secret technique that has made me victorious? I've arrived here by walking step by step. I didn't have a smooth sail like you did. I had to kill many powerful enemies. In fact, I barely managed to save my life many times. Only then have I managed to create this disparity in our strengths. It's not by a fluke. It's not luck. The second god's eyes turned somewhat dull after he had listened to Yi Shiwen's words. His vision wasn't conceited as before. It seemed as if he had realized that his perception wasn't the reality. He had finally come out of his illusion. He unceasingly groaned in a low voice. He had never imagined that he could lose in this manner. Actually, not lose, but outdone. He had always underestimated the bloodline of ordinary people. Yet, his noble bloodline lost today, and so had his pride. He had been certain of his victory in his heart, because he possessed the Titan bloodline. However, his bloodline had lost. And so, his ego had disappeared. I had forgotten about your army of God, and what had happened between us. I didn't expect that you would come forth so impatiently. You've courted your death by doing so. Nobody can save you now. Yi Zaiwen's countenance turned grim as he spoke. Yi Shiwen didn't wish to show any mercy. He and the second god had tried to kill each other countless times during the course of the battle. Only the death of one of these two could end this battle. Therefore, he was unlikely to show any mercy. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword soared in the sky. It streaked across the vast sky in a split second, and rushed towards the second god to split him apart. Is this the end? Will it end like this? This mortal combat will end with the defeat and death of the second god. Bang! A terrifying collision sound resounded. Yi Zaiwen's long sword had crashed into a big hand. That big hand was made up of energy, and it had grabbed Yi Zaiwen's long sword. Yi Zaiwen's complexion suddenly changed. Someone had dared to interfere in this battle of life or death. He looked upward. It was the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. Old man, what is the meaning of this? Yi Shiwen asked in a cold voice. There was no trace of respect in his words. This old man had left a very bad impression on him from the beginning. He had dared to provoke the Hidden Star Peak without any hesitation in order to support the second god. He had also injured the third brother. The elder merely turned towards the second god and shouted, You idiot! You should be happy that this only the outcome of a battle, nothing more. It's nothing. You have long way ahead. Your road is still quite long. Sage Realm? Even the great Sage Realm won't be the peak of your achievements. A temporary setback like this one is nothing. You will get the opportunity to bathe in the snow sooner or later. You can clear your reputation then. The second god's eyes gradually began to regain their vigor after he heard the senior elder's shout. He realized that this was merely a fight, nothing more. It was no big deal. He still had a future ahead of him. He could always get a chance to bathe in the snow and wash away his shame. He had always been an outstanding and shrewd talent. He had been terrified by Yi Shiwen for a short period of time. But the great confusion in his heart had vanished within a moment. His defeated state of mind had also vanished. In fact, it had regained its previous form by now. The elder seemed satisfied as he watched the second gods recover. He nodded with satisfaction. He had some regrets that Yi Shiwen wasn't dead. However, it didn't mean that the second god hadn't harvested anything from this battle. He was sure that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to escape next time. Yi Shiwen felt very regretful as he watched the second god regain his state of mind. He had scared the second god and seized his willpower with great difficulty. But the second god turned out to be fortunate since someone interfered. Yi Shiwen recalled this old man had previously said that the higher authorities had agreed to this mortal combat, and that no one was allowed to interfere. Yet, he himself had interfered. This was pure shamelessness. What was more annoying was the fact that the elder was still instigating the second god to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen in the future. You have no sense of shame, you old guy. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth tightly as he stated. Give it a rest. The battle has ended. It's hereby terminated, the senior elder flatly stated as if he was merely notifying everyone about the matter. To be continued. Chapter 402. Didn't your elders teach you how to respect an elder? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive them when possible. That elder from the Clear Sky Peak spoke with a strong sense of righteousness. He didn't seem to feel any shame in his heart. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. Yi Shiwen might have boundless future prospects. However, that was a matter for the future. He didn't care about it. He had the backing of the Clear Sky Peak, and it was one of the top 10 inheritances. Yi Shiwen wouldn't be a big threat for a top 10 inheritance even if he were to grow stronger in the future, even if he were to become a top-notch senior great sage expert. This was one of the main reasons why this elder had allowed the second god to kill Yi Shiwen despite the protests from the Hidden Star Peak. People don't care about an ant's feelings. They merely trample ants to death. Yi Shiwen must shed tears of thankfulness for not being stamped to death. That was the elder's way of thinking. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth and spoke. Respect an elder? It depends on whether you deserve it or not. Do you even behave like an elder? Moreover, you said that anyone can make mistakes. So one must forgive them when possible. But he came here to kill me. How can you possibly call it a forgivable mistake? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive them when possible. This was a great-sounding and pompous saying, but it had vanished long ago. This was a typical case of using double standards, one set of rules for other people, and a completely different set of rules when it comes to oneself. You're just a corrupt old fogey who likes to cheat by using double standards. Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted impolitely. Do you wish to die? It's true that you're a peerless genius who has boundless future prospects. However, you're not even a semi-sage expert at present. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak threatened him. His complexion turned somewhat unsightly. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. And he had dared to say such insulting words to him. This was an enormous provocation. It's genuinely laughable. Others mustn't interfere since the higher authorities have given their consent to this fight. These were your words. However, the man who shamelessly intervened at the end was you. Is your Clear Sky Peak filled with people like you? Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted. The killing intention flourished in Yi Shiwen's heart. This senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had a bias in the second god's favor. This inspired his killing intention, and the anger flourished multiplicatively. This was very pathetic. Firstly, they advocated this fight to death, and now they were against it. Everyone stared blankly at Yi Shiwen. He had held an extremely stubborn image in everyone's eyes since the beginning. He had even killed the law enforcement hall's disciples after having announced it beforehand. However, they hadn't anticipated him to be this arrogant. He was looking down on a senior elder of the great sage realm. He had even talked back maliciously, and had insulted the senior elder in the process. This elder of the great sage realm wasn't a generous person by nature. However, Yi Shiwen had still dared to be so courageous before him. This inspired a sense of reverence in people's hearts for Yi Shiwen. Well said. Clear Sky Peak is like this only. Bai Jiansong sneered as he came over to Yi Shiwen's side. He seemed in a somewhat distressed state. However, nothing could conceal his rebellious nature. They'll stop this old guy. You go and kill that guy. They'll see who dares to stop you. Damn it, didn't he say that the higher authorizers have given their consent? Bai Jiansong sneered. The anger in his eyes could burn the blue dome of sky. He certainly knew the intention of that Clear Sky Peak senior elder. The higher authorities had agreed to Yi Shiwen's slaughter by the second god's hands. And it was also clear who had made them do so. However, they couldn't say it openly. So, it seemed like they had only agreed for the two individuals to settle their personal grudges. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would gain an upper hand in this battle instead of the second god. Bai Jiansong was suddenly aggrieved in his mind. He didn't know what price the people of the Clear Sky Peak had paid. However, this matter hadn't ended yet. It seemed like the people who had approved this matter had only included one individual in their calculation, not the other. Bai Jiansong, is this what you teach your new disciples? The Titan body is a genius of our true martial university. He can become the backbone of our university in the future. Do you understand? The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak looked coldly at Bai Jiansong as he spoke. Well, that very individual lost in the battle. Yet you still dare to boast about him? Ha ha! I'm really out of words here if you're saying that this so-called genius of your Clear Sky Peak is proud that he can suppress an expert of lower realm. Bai Jian Song mocked in a satirical manner. Everyone secretly exclaimed in admiration. These two brothers were the same. Both of them were courageous, and had looked down on a so-called senior elder. Everyone understood Bai Jian Song's intention. The sarcastic meaning in Bai Jian Song's words was clear to everyone. He basically meant that the so-called geniuses of the Clear Sky Peak had no other talents apart from using their realm's advantage to suppress those at lower one. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had used the advantage of his cultivation level to suppress Bai Jian Song. And the second god had also tried to do the same to suppress Yi Shiwen. Therefore, everyone believed that this was indeed true. Perhaps Yi Shiwen and his fellow brother apprentice would have chased down their opponents like stray dogs if they had been in the same realm. The senior elder's complexion had turned ashen. These two brothers had repeatedly mocked him. His complexion had turned exceptionally unsightly as a result of this. Humph! I see. You people of the Hidden Star Peak are courting death, the senior elder threatened. Yi Shiwen rushed ahead. The huge devil wings behind his body had opened up. Yi Shiwen had dashed towards the second god like the flash of a golden lightning. His devil wings were flapping at an incredibly fast speed. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had unleashed the entirety of his strength. He arrived in front of the second god in a split second. Audacious! The senior elder went completely mad. Yi Shiwen had dared to make a move in his presence. This clearly demonstrated that Yi Shiwen had looked down on him. This suddenly sparked immense anger inside him. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak launched an attack almost instantly, and a shocking divine beam was sent rumbling towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's devil wings flapped behind him, and he dodged that sharp divine beam. Bang! The divine beam ripped open the space and the chaos leaked out. Everyone was terrified by this scene. Old man, you're truly shameless! Bai Jian Song released an astonishing sword beam. You can't recognize what's good for you! The senior elder snorted coldly. He grabbed that sword beam which could have easily cracked open the sky. And then, he crushed it. Afterward, he advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Ha! A delicate yet loud shout came from the horizon. The clouds began to tremble frantically. A magnificent attack streaked across the vast sky. It appeared like a giant black dragon as it swept down upon the senior elder. Bang! The senior elder couldn't evade this attack. A whip struck him, and his body was nearly split apart. Bang! That old man went flying in the sky. The whip's attack didn't kill him. It just inflicted minor injuries to his body. However, his complexion had turned exceptionally ugly. He looked towards the origination point of that attack with a dull look on his face. A delicate and charming figure slowly appeared from the void. She looked approximately 20 years old. Her skin was glowing like snow. Her eyebrows were curved, and her mouth was small. She looked extremely beautiful. She was clad in a fiery red dress. She held a long whip in her hand. She looked valiant and formidable. Second sister! A smile appeared on Bai Jian Song's face as he saw this woman. He also felt a bit relaxed. Yi Shiwen turned around to see. He had heard a lot about the well-known second sister. But this was the first time he was seeing her. Lu Yan'an was famous for being a practice maniac. She basically practiced all year round. It was quite difficult to force her out of her practice. Crash bang! Another whip was swept down towards the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. It sent sonic booms in all directions. It appeared like black lightning as it quickly arrived in front of the senior elder. The senior elder had no other choice but to retreat frantically in order to avoid this whip attack. Everyone was stunned. Some people had recognized her. This was Hidden Star Peak's second disciple. She was named Lu Yanlan. However, she had merely used one whip attack to compel the senior elder to retreat. This kind of strength was too incredible. No wonder the Hidden Star Peak was so strong. Huan Wuji was invincible. This second disciple, Lu Yanlan, wasn't easy to deal with either. Plus, Bai Jian Song had already stepped into the Great Sage realm. And Yi Shiwen also had the potential to enter the Great Sage realm if he didn't perish in the way. The true strength of the Hidden Star Peak had instilled a new level of reverence inside everyone's heart. The Hidden Star Peak was small yet proficient. It didn't have many people. However, they were elites, all of them. Lu Yanlan merely stood at her spot. Her aura was as tyrannical as an endless ocean. Her energy could swallow thousands of miles. She appeared like a goddess. Her temperament was ice-cold and unapproachable. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at her, and rushed towards the second god to kill him. He didn't even stop once. The second god saw Yi Shiwen approach him. He was startled. But he became furious as well. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would dare to launch an attack on him despite the opposition from the Clear Sky Peak senior elder. Moreover, Yi Shiwen looked desperate to kill him, and wasn't willing to let him off. Suddenly, his heart began to burn with anger. He had never realized that Yi Shiwen would have tried to kill him even if he hadn't insisted on a fight with Yi Shiwen. However, the upper echelons of the university would be alerted if Yi Shiwen were to kill him now. This obviously left Yi Shiwen to feel more threatened by the second god's existence. Things might become very messy in the future if Yi Shiwen were to spare the second god. "You wouldn't dare!" the second god roared loudly. "Stop!" the Clear Sky Peak's elder shouted. He wanted to help the second god. However, Lu Yanlan and Bai Jiansong couldn't possibly have allowed him succeed in his plan. They joined forces and launched attacks on him. Bang! The fight between those three great sage experts caused the collapse of the sky. The earth trembled, and the chaos leaked out from the spatial debris. The space got crushed wherever they trod. This great sage-level battle was exceptionally frightening for most spectators. Yi Shiwen had rushed towards the second god to kill him without showing any regard for the senior elder's opposition. The second god had recovered a lot since he had taken advantage of the time. However, his healing speed couldn't be compared with Yi Ziwen's. After all, Yi Shiwen had the Phoenix regeneration technique, while he didn't. Time had passed quickly, and he had only managed to recover to some extent. However, he didn't have the means to continue to withstand Yi Ziwen's attacks. Bang! He wasn't Yi Ziwen's opponent. Yi Ziwen's slap sent him flying into the sky. "I'm invincible!" The second god shouted in a somewhat demented manner. Yi Shiwen sneered. Yi Shiwen trod on a golden light, and arrived in front of the second god. Then, he launched a grindstone-like slap at him. "Stop!" the Clear Sky Peak's elder roared. However, Yi Shiwen paid no attention to it, and slapped the second god a second time. Bang! The second god's body was disintegrated by Yi Ziwen's slap. To be continued. Chapter 403. The Titan body was dead. The news exploded and spread throughout the True Martial University. It shook the entire True Martial University. This was the first time a Heaven's Pride level expert of the younger generation had died in a battle. However, this wasn't the thing that had shocked people the most. After all, the second god was the one who had issued the declaration for battle. Moreover, he had obtained the approval of the higher authorities. He had been able to issue a death match against Yi Shiwen as a result of this approval. Therefore, everyone knew that the battle between these two individuals wasn't going to end on a good note. In fact, one among them had to die. However, they had never thought that the person to die at the end would be the second god. Everyone had thought that it would be Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Ziwen's strength was much lower than the second god's since they latter had already entered the semi-sage realm. One must know that their realms differed by heaven and earth since Yi Shiwen hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm. Everyone below the sage realm was like an ant. The semi-sage realm obviously wasn't the same as the sage realm. However, it still had the word sage attached to it. So, it was bound to give immense strength. The legendary realm couldn't be compared with it. Therefore, everyone was optimistic that the second god would kill Yi Shiwen with ease. They had expected that he would thoroughly defeat Yi Shiwen at the very least. After all, Yi Zaiwen's realm differed by a significant margin. However, they hadn't anticipated that the person who would die in the end would turn out to be the second god. Moreover, Yi Shiwen hadn't used any cheap tricks to pull this off. He had depended on his tyrannical strength to suppress and then kill the second god. And that too after terrifying him. This had even scared the onlookers. They hadn't anticipated this outcome. The second god had nearly been driven to the point of insanity before death. Even the interference of a great sage expert hadn't been able to prevent his death. Yi Shiwen hadn't cared about facing the frightening coercion of a great sage expert. Word spread that Yi Shiwen had killed the second god. It caused a huge uproar. Countless people were discussing about this matter. They were discussing the possible consequences of this matter. The Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances. It certainly wouldn't shy away from expressing its wrath. The Hidden Star Peak wasn't a pushover either. It had already caused havoc throughout the War Dead Star Peak for Yi Shiwen. They weren't easy to deal with. That startling collision between the three great sage experts had transcended everyone's imagination. It had been a disastrous battle. A high-level expert was forced to arrive in order to prevent the two sides from killing each other. It didn't matter how the higher authorities would look into this matter. Yi Shiwen had suddenly become popular. Many people had started to remember him. People had initially believed that Yi Shiwen was at the bottom amongst the Heaven's Pride level experts. However, it didn't look like that now. Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength was perhaps sufficient to rank him amongst the top ones. He had become famous overnight. And that too in a world where many people were ambitious to compete on this road to invincibility. His peers felt a bit depressed. Yi Shiwen was powerful, and he wasn't even at the so-called 200th rank. Yet he had established a scary reputation for himself. This frightened everyone even more. Everyone had seen that Yi Shiwen succeeded in defeating his opponent by depending on his true strength alone. However, such ability seemed exceptionally dreadful. The Clear Sky Peak had no choice but to suffer in silence. This was the first time they had been forced into such a situation. After all, they were the ones who had advocated this battle. They had paid a considerably high price in order to get the approval of the higher authorizers. However, what about the outcome? The second god had gotten killed by Yi Shiwen in the end. They had been taken aback by this result. Nobody had anticipated such an outcome. They needed to have a reason to make noise. The Clear Sky Peak had wanted to impose itself onto the Hidden Star Peak, but couldn't say something like let Yi Shiwen die to compensate second god's death. They couldn't say it out aloud even if they wanted this to happen. They had no option but to accept this outcome. Nobody would know if something were to happen in private. However, they would have to appear peaceful from the outside, at the very least. Yi Zaiwen's name had thoroughly spread in the true martial university. It was reported that even the supreme officials had heard this name. Killing the second god had also brought piles of trouble for him. For example, he had suddenly become famous. He had been named a Heaven's Pride level expert before this battle. However, he hadn't been regarded on top thus far. That was because everyone considered him as the weakest amongst all the Heaven's Pride level experts. However, this notion had suddenly changed. The Titan guy was considered at the top of Heaven's Pride level experts. This was so because none of these Heaven's Pride level experts had ever indulged in a mutual conflict. The battle between Yi Shiwen and the second god was the very first collision between two Heaven's Pride level experts. Therefore, nobody could say who among these Heaven's Pride level experts was stronger, and who was weaker. However, the existing fact was that Yi Shiwen had killed the second god. So, he had suddenly become the target of public attention. He had also obtained the top position among the Heaven's Pride level experts on temporary basis. He used to have a low-key profile, and had stayed hidden on the side. However, he had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention at present. Of course, there were several disadvantages related to this. Yet, it also had advantages. One of the advantages was that he had obtained the attention of higher authorities. Yishiwen had come to be known as a Heaven's Pride level expert in the past. However, very few people regarded him as a genuine one. He hadn't been acknowledged by the higher authorities. After all, Yi Zaiwen's cultivation had been lower than the minimum requirement of half-step Legendary's great complete realm at the time. So, it was quite difficult to tell whether he had boundless future prospects or not. After all, he didn't seem much different from most of the ordinary people. The true martial university had been standing tall and upright in the southern region since countless years. They had even ruled the entire true martial world once upon a time. So, they wouldn't look at the short-lived fads. Rather, their gaze was fixed at the matters of the future several hundred, or even several thousand years from now. Therefore, it was quite difficult for a short-lived tyranny to attract their attention. Only the people who had at least practiced till half-step legendary 9th stage could obtain their acknowledgement. And even so, the experts of half-step legendary 9th stage were merely considered elites. Only the experts of half-step Legendary's great complete realm could be called as real Heaven's Pride level experts. One's present tyranny didn't ensure that they would remain as such in the future. They must be able to become the true martial university's backbone in the future, after 1,000 or several thousand years. This incident of agreeing to this death match had been largely related to this notion. Yishiwen hadn't made them feel that he was unexpendable. However, the situation had reversed after this incident. Yishiwen had obtained everyone's acknowledgement in its entirety. Therefore, the true martial university rewarded Yishiwen with a 100,000 primary spirit dawn after he had killed the second god. They gave him other rare herbs etc. as well. Yishiwen felt that he had genuinely obtained the true martial university's attention, not just materialistic rewards. Bai Jian-song had mentioned that this matter had alarmed one very senior person. This senior person had opened his mouth and spoken. "You've made enough noise. Now go back, and reflect on your mistakes in seclusion." The Clear Sky Peak had initially wanted to cause trouble. However, they had no other choice but to abandon their idea of causing trouble after looking at the power and influence of this senior person. The Clear Sky Peak certainly had the wrong stance in this matter. But that senior person seemed in a mood to punish the innocent and guilty alike. However, Yishiwen was rather pleased when he heard this news. This was indicative that the higher authorities wouldn't support the opposite party. Yishiwen had never hoped that the higher authorities would support him. However, this meant that they wouldn't cause any more trouble for him. This was the advantage of displaying strength. There were pros as well as cons to this. And to choose one of the two was beyond Yi Zaiwen's control. Yishiwen was grounded for a year, as a punishment for killing the second god. The higher authorities had issued the punishment. However, everyone felt that this judgment was extremely biased in favor of Yishiwen. The price for murder was death penalty. However, Yishiwen was only grounded for a year. This indeed seemed like a biased decision in Yi Zaiwen's favor to outsiders. However, both the sides involved in this matter were very much dissatisfied. The Clear Sky Peak felt that this punishment was too light as per Yi Zaiwen's conduct. However, the Hidden Star Peak felt otherwise. Yishiwen had killed the second god. But their side hadn't instigated this matter. Everyone had agreed upon this death match. In fact, many high-level officials had even witnessed the battle. Killing one's opponent in a death match shouldn't lead to a punishment of being grounded for a year. This didn't make sense. Had this been done to bully the handful members of the Hidden Star Peak? However, Yishiwen himself didn't complain. He could tell that the higher authorities were divided into two factions over this matter. He could tell that both the factions had arrived at a mutual compromise to conclude this matter. He didn't see any loss in this matter. There was no harm for him in being grounded for a year. In fact, he could seize this opportunity to consolidate this half-step legendary 9th stage realm. One could only imagine how difficult it would have been to condense principles in this realm. Yishiwen must spend time to consolidate these newly acquired things. And this was the best chance. The only problem was that he had planned to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. This trip could only be put down for now. Time passed quickly. It didn't stop for anyone. It passed day by day. The effects of the sensation caused by Yishiwen also faded away with time. Several people would arrive every day at the Hidden Star Peak after Yishiwen had been grounded for a year. They'd hoped to see Yishiwen, who was undergoing closed-door training at the steep cliff of the Hidden Star Peak. They would often come to take a look at this temporary top Heaven's Pride level expert of the younger generation. However, this sensation slowly quieted down like any other matter along with the passage of time, day by day, month by month. It had slowly disappeared from people's discussions too. No new news disseminated during the 1 year's time that Yishiwen spent grounded. It was indeed a short-lived fad. So, people forgot this person named Yishiwen. Yishiwen was happy being idle since he could practice properly. He could comprehend the Tao principles without being disturbed by the others. To be continued. Half-step legendary 9th stage. There is a gap of one entire realm between Yishiwen and second god. Realm versus stage. Think of realm as an accomplishment in martial arts. But there are usually several stages that one must cross in order to attain one accomplishment. And one attains new powers and expertise with each new accomplishment. Sometimes, these changes are qualitative. For example, if a semi-sage expert releases a certain amount of energy, it should be able to beat the same amount of energy released by an expert of lower realm. That's because the semi-sage level energy is qualitatively superior. The same can be said about one's physical strength. However, not many changes on the qualitative side occur with each new stage. Only quantitative changes occur. Chapter 404. 1 year passed. The Hidden Star Peak was still the same as it was 1 year ago. It was still tall and lofty. It still seemed as if it would pierce the sky. It had been nearly restored to normal appearance post the destruction caused by the startling battle that had taken place over a year ago. It had been the same since hundreds of thousands of years, somewhat desolate, but with a boundless presence. Ma Wenrui was an ordinary former disciple of the Heavenly Ocean Peak. This peak was situated in the vicinity of the Hidden Star Peak. He would pass through the Hidden Star Peak every day. He had done so for over 100 years. He had entered the true martial university over 100 years ago. He had traveled like this every day ever since because he wasn't an elite disciple. So, he wasn't qualified enough to reside on the Heavenly Ocean Peak. Therefore, he had to travel to the Heavenly Ocean Peak to attend lectures every day. Afterwards, he would return to the city. He passed through the Hidden Star Peak today as well, just like every other day. It was nothing special. He had been doing this for more than 100 years. However, the peak had turned a bit livelier over the last 2 years. The disciples of this peak had obtained a whole new level of respect in the eyes of the people. Huang Wuji, Yishiwen, Lu Yanlan, and Bai Jian Song were once unknown names. But the reputation of these individuals had slowly spread in these few years. Their reputation might brought more trouble to their doorstep. However, provoking them wasn't a good thing. The law enforcement hall had provoked them once. Several of their disciples had been slaughtered as a result. And one Heaven's Pride level disciple had also died doing the same. This was disastrous loss. The War Dead Star Peak had also dared to provoke them once. Consequently, their chief had been chased around like a stray god. Even the Clear Sky Peak had provoked them once. And they were amongst the top 10 inheritances. Their Heaven's Pride level expert had been killed in the end. Even the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had been put into a distressed situation by the joint attacks of Bai Jian Song and Lu Yanlan. So, they weren't able to get any benefit in the end either. In fact, they had paid a huge price in order to get the approval of the high-level experts. However, their future chief had ended up getting killed in the end. Yet, they hadn't been able to obtain anything. This series of incidents had made the Hidden Star Peak famous. Many ordinary disciples had gotten unusually envious of them. The Hidden Star Peak was like a huge hornet nest. Poke any one of them, and that might provoke a bunch of people. Something like this naturally wasn't possible in other inheritances. Other inheritances had more than hundreds of thousands of disciples. So, only the super elites enjoyed such privileged treatment. Otherwise, those elders and superiors would have to deal with such matters all day long. Suddenly, Ma Wen-rui felt an enormous pressure rise upon his heart. One could clearly see that countless black clouds had assembled in the sky. And they were moving in the hidden star peak's direction. An exceptional heavenly tribulation hovered over the hidden star peak. This attracted the attention of many people. The true martial university was certain very large. However, it wasn't a big thing for these people with supernatural powers. Any activity in any area could easily attract the attention of several people. Not to mention that this strange event was happening at the hidden star peak. A majority of people had gradually forgotten the hidden star peak after the big event that had taken place a year ago. However, several resolute and interested individuals hadn't forgotten about it. Ma Wen-rui was panic-stricken since he realized that this heavenly tribulation was far beyond his imagination. It wasn't an ordinary tribulation that merely rained down thunder and lightning at its target. Rather, this one comprised of a group of lightning soldiers. All of them were clad in metal armors, and held long spears in their hands. They were vigorously rushing towards the hidden star peak to kill their target at this moment. This scene nearly scared him to death. He had seen such heterogeneous heavenly tribulations, but only in ancient books. However, he hadn't seen such a frightening heterogeneous heavenly tribulation in real life. Those soldiers possessed the strength of semi-sage realm. They possessed extremely tyrannical strength. Their bodies were condensed of lightning Tao principles, and magical symbols were floating around them. This spectacle would frighten anyone. The entire hidden star peak had turned into a huge battlefield. Hundreds of lightning soldiers swept down like a rain of lightning and launched attacks. Each one of these attacks was an exceptionally horrifying martial art. A figure was marching back and forth among these lightning soldiers. His hands were like claws. And these claws were emitting golden light of Tao. Each time he attacked with his golden claws, a lightning soldier would get ripped apart. It would then transform into energy, and would get absorbed by him. Yi Zaiwen's complexion was the same as usual. Even this many lightning soldiers couldn't make him anxious. This heavenly tribulation was more terrifying than the previous ones. This was comprised of an army of lightning soldiers. These were more dreadful than those lightning apes, or the lightning demon beasts, and so on. It was as if the heavens will itself had taken form, and had crusaded against this evildoer, since he had surpassed the tolerance and patience of the heavens. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's palm pierced through a lightning soldier. The tyrant body technique was operating throughout his body. That lightning soldier got absorbed by Yi Shiwen. And the transformed lightning went inside Yi Zaiwen's universe. A tremendous change was occurring inside Yi Zaiwen's universe since he was absorbing endless amount of such formidable energy. The quantity of cosmic dust increased more and more. His universe had started to appear more and more like the real one. A new planet began to form inside the solar system by attracting and accumulating countless dusts. The planet finally took shape, and began to revolve on its orbit around the sun. Each of these lightning soldiers was a terrifying expert of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. An expert of the semi-sage realm would be an awful opponent for any other individual. However, they were unworthy in front of Yi Shiwen. It wasn't that these lightning soldiers were weak or anything. Rather, Yi Shiwen was too powerful. He had used this over a year's time to practice. The number of principles within his body had also reached the upper limit of his capacity. He had condensed 299 principles. Of course, the number of new Tao principles that he had condensed in this duration wasn't much. However, these newly condensed principles were 10 times more powerful than the ones he had condensed in the past. That was because the degree of condensation was very solid and deep. This had increased Yi Zaiwen's strength tremendously. In fact, his one causal punch could blast away a dozen experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm at once. Yi Shiwen wasn't even afraid of the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, he would be able to condense 200 more Tao principles after he had crossed the heavenly tribulation. Then, had be able to beat an ordinary expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Bang! 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 Those lightning soldiers would collaborate from time to time. But they still couldn't sway Yi Shiwen. In fact, he didn't even need to defend himself. He merely used his palm to grab and explode these lightning soldiers. Yi Shiwen had genuinely started to feel the benefits of laying a solid foundation. His foundation was very profound, and his strength was very tyrannical. As a result, he was crossing this tribulation quite easily. He might have succeeded in crossing this tribulation a year ago with the help of his strength. However, he wouldn't have crossed it this easily. Each of these lightning soldiers was only marginally weaker than the last year's Yi Shiwen. Therefore, their sheer number might have succeeded in defeating Yi Shiwen a year ago. However, Yi Shiwen could easily wrap them up at present. This was the advantage of laying a robust foundation and a profound martial power. Yi Shiwen was unaware that several people had gathered to see him cross the tribulation. They were nearly scared to death as they witnessed this. Each of those lightning soldiers appeared like a god to them. Each one of them had iron armors and long spears. It seemed as if these soldiers were on an expedition. However, they couldn't even withstand a few moves that Yi Shiwen casted. They were getting annihilated left and right. They were no match for him. The manner in which Yi Shiwen went about on a killing spree inside that group of lightning soldiers made it seem as if a god had descended into the mortal world. This left countless people to evaluate Yi Shiwen at an even higher level. In fact, nobody said anything regarding Yi Shiwen's title of a Heaven's Pride level expert from the moment he began to cross this tribulation of the Great Complete Realm. Some people had questioned his title in the past. They had said that he hadn't yet reached the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, nobody would say that now. This heavenly tribulation was extremely scary. But it was evident that crossing it wouldn't be difficult for Yi Shiwen judging by the power he was displaying. This also meant that Yi Shiwen would become even more terrifying after he had entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Bang! 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 These lightning soldiers were ferocious and unafraid of death. They rushed forward one by one. Each of them displayed exquisite martial arts. However, they were too weak to compete against Yi Shiwen. They were slaughtered, one after the other. The heavenly tribulation ended. The planet Uranus had been fully condensed inside Yi Shiwen's universe. The solar system had improved by one step. Bang! Yi Shiwen's aura became uncontrollable, and it surged towards the sky. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Yi Shiwen's aura got thicker, fuller and richer. It could be said that the earlier Yi Shiwen was like an unsheathed sword, sharp. But he was now like a sword that was inside the sheath. Not shining, but far more frightening. Yi Shiwen's legendary level power had grown even richer after he entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. It had reached the level of perfection. That's why it was exhibiting such a rich feeling. Yi Shiwen felt a familiar yet strange energy flowing inside his body. It was different from what it had been in the past. It had previously seemed as if a huge barrier was blocking his way. However, this barrier had suddenly vanished. It seemed as if an unseen force had been firmly stopping him from having a breakthrough and condensing 300 Tao principles in his body. But this unseen power had suddenly vanished. Yi Shiwen promptly sat cross-legged. He began to absorb the power of the surrounding principles, and started to condense them into Tao principles in the form of magical symbols inside his body. The Tao principles appeared like magical symbols as they began to spin inside his body. They gradually condensed and emitted a mysterious aura. 299. 300. 350. 400. The count of Tao principles inside Yi Shiwen's body reached 400, and he started to feel that the accommodation of principles within his body had temporarily reached a saturation point. He would need to temper and refine his body further in order to go past the mark of 500 Tao principles. This amount was required to enter the later half of the semi-sage realm. However, Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength was already sufficient to compete with the top experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh of relief. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm. His foundation had become very robust. This showed that he didn't possess less potential than those other Heaven's Pride level experts. Yi Shiwen was extremely happy about this. The heavenly tribulation had just ended. A pretty figure appeared treading on the rainbow light, and arrived on the hidden star peak. To be continued. Chapter 405. Yi Shiwen has successfully crossed the great complete level's tribulation. His foundation must reach perfection. His power must soar up high. Yes. Reaching half-step Legendary's great complete realm is like turning into a dragon from a fish. He's no longer an ordinary person. It's not surprising that Yi Shiwen managed to kill that Titan guy. He has crossed an extremely terrifying heavenly tribulation. An average person would have met with an untimely death. However, Yi Shiwen treated it like it was nothing. Was that heavenly phoenix body who just passed by? Yes, that's her. I've seen her only once, from afar at that. But why has she arrived at the hidden star peak? Several people were discussing about today's tribulation. Yi Shiwen had once again gained importance in everyone's eyes. Sister Hua. Yi Shiwen was surprised for a moment. He didn't expect that the person to arrive would be Hua Menghan. However, he saw a woman clad in black dress. She looked approximately 17 to 18 years old. Her eyebrows were black and curved. She had a tiny mouth and bright eyes. Her fluid glance moved like ripples. Her skin was as white as snow and had a jade-like texture. It was as if a fairy had descended on earth. Her beauty seemed pure and untainted. Wasn't this really Hua Menghan? Yi Shiwen saw her treading on the rainbow light. She arrived in front of him in an instant, like a streak of electric flash. He was greatly surprised by this. Hua Menghan had restrained her aura. But the principles were faintly fluctuating in her aura. She had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. She was surprisingly a bit faster than him in terms of cultivation. Long time no see, Sister Hua. You're still as elegant as before. Your cultivation is somewhat ahead of mine. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Hua Menghan's progress had been incredibly fast. He had heard the discussions of the surrounding disciples. He hadn't anticipated that Hua Menghan would turn out to be that heavenly phoenix body. Yi Shiwen had recently established his power and glory, but the other Heaven's Pride level experts had carried their own titles for a long time. In fact, people seemed to have forgotten their real names as the time had passed. Yi Shiwen had heard the name Heavenly Phoenix Body many times. However, he had never thought that it would be referring to Hua Menghan. However, it wasn't a big deal even if she had the Heavenly Phoenix Body. These Heaven's Pride level experts had magnificent innate talent. In addition, many of them had special physiques. Moreover, their respective inheritances put their entire energy and resources to groom them. They could obtain the guidance of their seniors in case of any difficulty. The Hidden Star Peak was in a bit of a difficult position in this regard. In fact, it was far worse than the other inheritances in this regard. The first disciple Huang Wuji was perennially absent from the peak. The second sister was always undergoing vigorous closed-door training. The third brother, Bai Jian Song, would also disappear occasionally. These three powerhouses were always a complete mess, and were mostly focused on closed-door training. That was because they had to rely on their innate talents because it was hard to have breakthroughs. The other two disciples, namely, Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian, were slightly lacking in the aptitude section. They had recently stepped into the later stage of the semi-sage realm with the help of the complete version of the Hidden Star scripture that Yi Shiwen had comprehended. The two of them had deep foundations as they had stepped into Legendary's great complete realm several decades ago. So, they had suddenly obtained successive breakthroughs after they had comprehended the complete version of the Hidden Star scripture. They had deep foundations. So, they should be able to step into the sage realm before they came to a halt. However, there was no way to consistently get directions from the inheritance, or the seniors at this peak. Therefore, the practice conditions of this peak's disciples couldn't be compared with those of the privileged Heaven's Pride level experts at the other ones. In fact, an average person would have given up if they were in their place. Thanks to the mysterious space, Yi Shiwen could comprehend all the martial arts techniques. He didn't need the guidance of the teachers, and could well walk on his own. Otherwise, he would have fallen far behind based on the aptitude he had. However, this came with a heavy requirement for Spirit Dawn. Hua Menghan smiled faintly. Her fine black hair was covered with a shawl. She was as elegant as a fairy. Her demeanor had become deeper as her cultivation had become more profound. She was standing in front of him at this moment. However, she could fly up and get anywhere anytime. "Where have you been all this time? I heard that you also killed that Titan body. It has caused a huge sensation in the true martial university." Hua Menghan spoke in her mellowed, sweet voice. Yi Shiwen smiled bitterly. This matter had gained him a lot of fame. However, he hadn't intended it. He and the Titan guy had been mortal enemies from the beginning. So, there was no way he would have held back. The two of them walked side by side on the lane of the hidden star peak. The setting sun was sketching a beautiful portrait in the background. Their shadows were long cast on a lane that no one had used in a long time. So, it had turned somewhat desolate and bleak. Various kinds of herbs and fruits had overgrown at its edges. And the ones growing on the lane itself were gently brushing against their hands and leaving faint prints. "We are the people of Jianghu. We are bound to go through pain and suffering," Yi Shiwen replied with a smile. Hua Menghan chuckled and spoke. "Don't talk about pain and suffering. So many people in the true martial university are envious of you now." "As if the bird has finally raised its head and revealed itself in the forest," Yi Shiwen indifferently said. Then, he changed the topic. "However, one can only reach the top by overcoming the obstacles. I know this is your style." Hua Menghan looked at Yi Shiwen and spoke. "I knew long ago that your heart had big desires. Yi Yuan School couldn't entrap you. And the true martial university won't be able to contain you either." "Ha ha ha, you have more confidence in me than I do." Yi Shiwen laughed out loud. They were suddenly at a loss for words, and didn't know what to say. They remained silent for a moment and walked ahead. A long while passed. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and said, "There are many things in this world which don't happen according to one's wishes. And then, we are left with no choices. I wish to walk on this road, and I wish to walk to the top. And one day the road will end. My fate is under my control, not the heavens. It's very important for you, isn't it?" Hua Menghan asked this question out of the blue. "Eh?" Yi Shiwen replied somewhat doubtfully. "You have always gone very fast. You never care about the scenery that you leave behind. You just keep going farther and farther away," Hua Menghan said. Yi Shiwen was somewhat speechless. Perhaps, Hua Menghan was right. He had never harbored a sense of belonging to this world. He cared about his close relatives. But he had never cared about other stuff. In fact, he hardly cared about anything. That was the reason why neither Yi Yuan School nor the true martial university would be able to contain him. He genuinely possessed a heart with big desires. It seemed as if he just couldn't find any other thing to be worthy of his attention and care. Yi Shiwen looked at Hua Menghan. He didn't realize that the sun had already set. The moon had quietly climbed up the sky. The somewhat ice-cold moonlight had started to sprinkle on the earth. Hua Menghan looked extraordinarily delicate and beautiful under the moonlight. Her aura also appeared somewhat magical and fairy-like. It was difficult to put his heart's feeling in words. He didn't know what to say. It was a beautiful and charming scene, somewhat like the first time he had met her. "I didn't expect that the Sister Hua would turn out to be Heavenly Phoenix body with the blood of the ancient Heavenly Phoenix," Yi Shiwen spoke. Yemo had told him that the Heavenly Phoenix possessed the noblest blood among all the phoenixes. They were the strongest among all the phoenixes, and were called the King of Phoenixes. Their status could be compared with the nine-clawed golden dragon of the dragon race. However, the heavenly phoenix race had disappeared without a trace long ago. Hua Menghan wanted to say this aloud, but didn't. Rather, she muttered to herself, "I would rather not have this bloodline. It's too heavy a burden to shoulder. Too heavy." Then, she abruptly smiled. Her bright smile blossomed like a spring flower. It was devastatingly beautiful. "I may never be able to catch up with you if I'm not quicker." Eh? Yi Shiwen gawked for a second. It seemed as if he was still trying to figure out what she meant by that. "Nothing. Forget what I just said." Hua Menghan spoke with a smile. "I have come here for a reason. Do you know about the chaotic heavenly territory?" Yi Shiwen became serious and replied, "Yes, I know. It's located in the foreign territory. There was a lot of chaos in the chaotic heavenly territory. The people of the true martial world weren't the only ones to visit it. It was home to many escaped criminals from the other regions. It wouldn't be wrong to say that it was very chaotic. In fact, many experts of the Great Sage realm and above could be found in the depths of the chaotic heavenly territory. They were the self-proclaimed kings of their territories. But the areas closer to the true martial world were less dangerous since the experts found they weren't too powerful. After all, there were too many experts inside the true martial world. The Great Sage experts were also in abundance. So, the unaffiliated experts and criminals of Great Sage realm didn't dare to come in the vicinity of the true martial world. "I have recently come out from my closed-door training. I'm planning to proceed towards the chaotic heavenly territory for practice. So, would you like to go together?" Hua Menghan asked. "The others have already entered the chaotic heavenly territory." Yi Shiwen knew that Hua Menghan meant the other Heaven's Pride level experts. "Well, why not? My punishment sentence will end in a few days. Then, we can go together." Yi Shiwen had been planning to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. It was a coincidence that Hua Menghan also wanted to go. Now, they could go together as companions. Several days passed in the blink of an eye. Yi Ziwen's punishment also ended. Nobody had put surveillance on him. However, Yi Shiwen didn't wish to challenge the dignity of the university either. The house arrest ended very quietly. Yi Shiwen had already flown away into the endless void along with Hua Menghan by the time some people remembered that it was time for his punishment to end. There was endless void outside the true martial world on the way to the chaotic heavenly territory. They had to fly past millions of feet thick atmosphere. They had to make their way through the thunder and lightning. There were different kinds of extremely frightening astral winds in the way as well. These winds could easily blast a truth-level expert to death. They could even blow away the experts of legendary realm and cause serious injuries to them. It was indeed a very dangerous place. However, both of them were top experts. Hua Menghan had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. And Yi Ziwen's gilded tyrant form was very tyrannical. Hua Menghan was wrapped in a layer of silver-white flame. The astral winds that struck her body would get burnt into fragments by this flame. Yi Ziwen's gilded tyrant form was discharging golden rays of light. He merely allowed the astral winds to caress his body. He wouldn't get swayed at all. Even so, the two of them had to face difficulties as they moved ahead. They flew non-stop for 2 days, and covered several hundred kilometers. The thick atmosphere of the true martial world is extremely terrifying. The Earth's atmosphere doesn't even come close. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh and muttered to himself. They had faced many difficulties during their flight. The true martial world's atmosphere was much higher and thicker than that of the Earth's. It was extremely dangerous as well. Only sage experts could freely travel through it. It was very difficult for the semi-sage experts to pass through it. And the ordinary legendary experts would get blown away and sustain serious injuries. Yi Shiwen had arrived in the foreign territory once before, but he had used the transportation portal. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to pass through this atmosphere since he only had the strength of legendary realm back then. To be continued, You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.